Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The wind howls across the Norwegian fjords, carrying with it whispers of 1,000-year-old terror. Beneath these ancient skies, where longships once carved through icy waters and Viking warriors sang their death songs, lies one of history's most horrifying mysteries. The camera sweeps over weathered stone carvings, their runic inscriptions barely visible after centuries of harsh Nordic winters. In the dancing shadows of firelight, we glimpse fragments of a ritual so brutal, so unthinkable, that scholars still debate whether it ever truly existed at all. The Blood Eagle. Even the name sends shivers through those who hear it whispered in academic halls and archaeological sites across Scandinavia. Was it real? Was it myth? Or was it something far more complex, a weapon of psychological warfare wrapped in the poetry of medieval storytelling? The heavy, ominous beating of Norse drums echoes across the landscape as we begin our journey into one of the Viking Age's darkest corners. The medieval texts speak in hushed, terrifying tones. "He carved the eagle upon his back," reads one passage from an ancient saga, the words seeming to float across the screen like ghostly runes. These are not the words of eyewitnesses, but of storytellers writing centuries after the Viking Age had ended, when the old gods had given way to Christian crosses and the longships had rotted on forgotten shores. Yet their descriptions are so vivid, so precise in their horror, that they have haunted readers for nearly a millennium. The primary sources are few but chilling. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written in 13th century Iceland, describes the ritual with clinical precision. The Orkneyinga saga tells of kings and jarls meeting their end through this most terrible of deaths. Ragnar's saga Lodbrokar weaves the Blood Eagle into the legendary tales of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons and their quest for vengeance. But these texts were written 200 to 300 years after the events they claim to describe, composed by Christian scribes in an age when the old Viking world was already fading into legend. Dr. Sara Eriksson, a medieval historian at the University of Copenhagen, appears on screen surrounded by ancient manuscripts. When we examine these texts, she explains, we must remember that they were written long after the supposed events took place. The sagas were as much entertainment as they were history. They served to preserve cultural memory, yes, but they also served to create compelling narratives that would captivate their audiences. The Old Norse language itself provides clues to the mystery. The phrase rista örn, to carve an eagle, appears in the earliest sources. But was this literal or metaphorical? The Vikings were masters of poetic language, their skaldic poetry dense with metaphors and kennings that transformed simple actions into complex symbolic statements. Could carving the eagle have been a poetic way of describing something else entirely? Or were the medieval chroniclers recording, with terrible accuracy, the details of a ritual that actually took place? If the accounts are to be believed, the Blood Eagle was a form of execution so elaborate and so brutal that it transcended mere punishment and entered the realm of ritual sacrifice. The victim would be secured face down, their back exposed to the executioner's blade. The ribs would then be severed from the spine with surgical precision one by one, until they could be spread outward like the wings of a great bird. The lungs would be pulled through the opening, arranged to complete the gruesome resemblance to an eagle's spread wings. Finally, salt would be poured into the wound, whether to preserve the victim's agony or to complete some ritual purification. The sources do not agree. Dr. Michael Hansen, a forensic pathologist who has consulted on historical cases, provides a medical perspective that adds chilling reality to these ancient descriptions. From a purely anatomical standpoint, he explains, the procedure described in the sagas would be technically possible, but survival through even the initial stages would be virtually impossible. The trauma to the nervous system, the blood loss, the shock. A person would likely lose consciousness within minutes and die shortly thereafter. If this was ever performed, it would have been more symbolic than a prolonged torture. The clinical nature of Dr. Hansen's analysis makes the ancient accounts seem even more surreal. Computer-generated anatomical models demonstrate the process described in the sagas, the animation clean and educational, yet somehow making the horror more palpable by its very sterility. The precision required, the knowledge of human anatomy it would demand. These details suggest that if the Blood Eagle was real, it was not the work of berserkers in battle fury, but of ritual specialists who understood exactly what they were doing. But to understand the Blood Eagle, we must first understand the world that supposedly created it. The Viking Age was not simply a time of mindless violence and savage raids. It was a complex era of exploration, trade, political manoeuvring, and cultural exchange. Yet it was also undeniably a time when violence served both practical and symbolic purposes. The Vikings had numerous methods of punishment and execution: outlawry, which effectively sentenced a person to death by exile; simple beheading, drowning, or enslavement. In this context, why would they develop something as elaborate and time-consuming as the Blood Eagle? Dr. James Thornton, an expert on medieval Scandinavian culture, offers perspective from his office overlooking the ruins of a Viking Age settlement. We must remember that the Vikings were not unique in their capacity for ritualized violence. Across medieval Europe, we see elaborate forms of execution: drawing and quartering in England, flaying in various cultures, crucifixion in the Roman world. What made Viking punishment distinctive was often its symbolic content, its connection to their religious and mythological worldview. The comparison to other brutal punishments of the medieval world is sobering. The Blood Eagle, if it existed, was no more horrific than many accepted practices of its time. What made it unique was not its brutality, but its symbolism. And here we enter the realm of Norse mythology and religious belief that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The eagle held profound significance in Norse culture. It was sacred to Odin, the All-Father, the god of war, wisdom, and death. Eagles perched on the world tree Yggdrasil, serving as messengers between the realms of gods and men. The great eagle Vedrfolnir sat atop the highest branches, while the dragon Nidugga gnawed at the roots below. In this cosmological framework, the eagle represented not just death, but transformation, the soul's journey from the earthly realm to the halls of the gods. Dr. Astrid Nielsen, a specialist in Norse mythology, explains the deeper meanings from her research centre in Reykjavik. In Norse thought, death in battle was the highest honour, guaranteeing a place in Valhalla. The eagle, as Odin's creature, might have been seen as a way of ensuring that the victim's soul reached the god of the slain. But there's another interpretation: the eagle as a symbol of total humiliation, of reducing a person to carrion for Odin's birds. This duality, honour or humiliation, runs through many interpretations of the Blood Eagle. Was it a way of sending an enemy's soul to Valhalla with honour, or was it the ultimate degradation, transforming a human being into food for scavengers? The ambiguity may be intentional, reflecting the complex Norse understanding of death, honour, and divine will. The mythological context also raises questions about the literal truth of the accounts. Norse culture was deeply metaphorical, with reality and myth intertwining in ways that modern minds find difficult to parse. When the sagas describe someone having the eagle carved upon his back, are they recording a historical event, or are they using mythological language to describe a spiritual or political transformation? The historical record provides us with specific names and circumstances, though each account raises more questions than it answers. The most famous alleged victim was Ella of Northumbria, the Anglo-Saxon king who supposedly captured and killed the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Ube, and Hvitserk, invaded England in 865 CE, seeking vengeance for their father's death. When they finally captured King Ella, they subjected him to the Blood Eagle as retribution. The account is dramatic and satisfying in its narrative completeness, but historians note several problems. First, the historical Ragnar Lothbrok is himself a figure who may be more legend than reality, a composite of several different Viking leaders whose exploits became conflated over time. Second, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which records the great heathen army's invasion of England, makes no mention of Ella suffering any particular brutal death. He is simply recorded as having died in battle. The Blood Eagle enters the story only in later Scandinavian sources written long after the events. King Edmund of East Anglia presents another problematic case. Later medieval sources claim that he too suffered the Blood Eagle at the hands of Viking raiders, but contemporary accounts describe his death quite differently. The Anglo-Saxon sources, written much closer to the events, describe Edmund as having been shot with arrows after refusing to renounce his Christian faith, a death that made him a martyr and saint. The Blood Eagle narrative appears to have been grafted onto his story later, possibly as Christian chroniclers sought to emphasise the pagan brutality of their enemies. Other alleged victims include Halfdan the Black and King Mael Gwale, figures so obscure that their very existence is disputed by some historians. In each case, the Blood Eagle narrative appears in sources written long after the supposed events, often in contexts where it serves a specific literary or political purpose, rather than simply recording historical fact. The archaeological record, which might be expected to provide concrete evidence of such a distinctive form of execution, remains frustratingly silent. Dr. Ingrid Larsen, a forensic anthropologist who has examined hundreds of Viking Age skeletal remains, speaks from her laboratory, surrounded by ancient bones and measurement tools. We found evidence of many forms of violence in Viking Age burials: sword cuts, arrow wounds, blunt force trauma, but we've never found skeletal remains that show the specific pattern of rib separation that would be consistent with the Blood Eagle as described in the sagas. The absence of archaeological evidence is particularly striking given the distinctive nature of the supposed ritual. The systematic severing of ribs from the spine would leave clear marks on the bones, marks that should be visible even after 1,000 years. Yet despite extensive excavations across the Viking world, from Iceland to Kiev, from Dublin to York, no such evidence has emerged. This absence doesn't definitively prove that the Blood Eagle never happened. Bodies might have been disposed of in ways that prevented their preservation, or the ritual might have been so rare that we simply haven't found the right graves. But the silence of the archaeological record adds weight to the arguments of those who see the Blood Eagle as literary invention, rather than historical reality. The question then becomes, if the Blood Eagle was not a common Viking practice, why do the stories persist? Why did medieval chroniclers invest such effort in describing something that may never have happened? The answer may lie in the psychology of warfare and the power of fear as a weapon. Dr. Richard Blackwood, a military historian specialising in medieval warfare, explains the concept from his study lined with books on ancient battles. Psychological warfare has been a constant throughout human history. The reputation for exceptional brutality can be more valuable than any sword or shield. If your enemies believe you capable of unthinkable acts, they may surrender without fighting, or fight less effectively due to fear. The Vikings understood this principle well. Their very name struck terror across medieval Europe, and they cultivated this reputation carefully. The berserkers, warriors who fought in apparent frenzy, may have been as much performance art as military tactic. The distinctive dragon-headed longships were designed to inspire fear as much as to navigate rivers and seas. In this context, the Blood Eagle begins to make sense not as a regular punishment, but as a weapon of terror, something that might be threatened more often than performed, but whose very possibility would haunt the minds of enemies. The stories may have grown in the telling, embellished with each generation of storytellers until a simple execution became an elaborate ritual, until metaphor became literal description. But even if the Blood Eagle was more threat than reality, the psychological impact was real enough. Medieval chroniclers across Europe wrote of Viking brutality with a mixture of horror and fascination that suggests the reputation had achieved its intended effect. The role of Christian chroniclers in shaping the Blood Eagle narrative cannot be overlooked. Many of the most detailed accounts come from Christian sources, written at a time when the Church was actively working to convert the last pagan regions of Europe. In this context, stories of pagan brutality served a specific purpose. They demonstrated the moral superiority of Christian civilization and justified the often violent process of conversion. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a specialist in medieval religious texts, examines this aspect from her archive of illuminated manuscripts. We must remember that medieval chronicles were not neutral historical documents. They were written by people with specific religious and political agendas. Stories of pagan brutality served to justify Christian conquest and to emphasize the moral transformation that conversion represented. The linguistic evidence supports this interpretation. Many of the most vivid descriptions of the Blood Eagle come from Latin chronicles written by monks who may never have spoken Old Norse. The possibility of mistranslation, of poetic metaphors being taken literally, of cultural misunderstanding being preserved as historical fact, haunts every analysis of these sources. The phrase "rista urn" itself, to carve an eagle, might have been a kenning, a metaphorical description that meant something quite different from its literal translation. Norse poetry was famous for its complex metaphors, where whale road meant sea and battle sweat meant blood. Could carving the eagle have been a poetic way of describing something else entirely, perhaps simply killing someone in battle, or dedicating their death to Odin? Yet the blood eagle has transcended its historical origins to become a fixture of modern popular culture. From television shows like Vikings to video games like Assassin's Creed, from novels to films like The Northman, the ritual continues to fascinate contemporary audiences. These modern portrayals often take considerable liberties with the historical sources, presenting the blood eagle as a common Viking practice rather than a disputed historical possibility. Dr. Thomas Meyer, a cultural historian who studies the modern reception of Viking culture, observes this phenomenon from his office, decorated with movie posters and academic texts. What's interesting is how the blood eagle has become almost synonymous with Viking brutality in popular culture, despite the fact that its historical reality is highly questionable. It represents something appealing to modern audiences, the idea of ultimate ritualized revenge, of violence elevated to the level of art. These modern interpretations often miss the religious and cultural context that made the blood eagle meaningful to medieval audiences. They present it as simple sadism rather than complex ritual, as random violence rather than symbolic act. Yet they also demonstrate the enduring power of the image, its ability to capture something essential about how we imagine the Viking world. The scholarly debate over the blood eagle's reality continues to evolve. Some historians, like Dr. Erickson, lean towards seeing it as largely mythical, a literary creation that served specific narrative purposes but had little basis in historical reality. Others, like Dr. Thornton, argue for a middle position, that some form of the ritual may have existed, but was extremely rare and became exaggerated in the retelling. A third group of scholars argues that the question of literal reality misses the point entirely. They suggest that the blood eagle should be understood as a mythological construct, a story that revealed important truths about Viking culture and values, even if it never described actual events. In this interpretation, the ritual's symbolic meaning, its connection to Odin, to honour, to the transformation of death, was more important than its literal performance. Professor Gunnar Thorsen, one of Iceland's leading saga scholars, represents this viewpoint from his office overlooking Reykjavik harbour. The sagas were never intended to be historical documents in the modern sense. They were cultural texts, stories that preserved and transmitted the values, beliefs and worldview of medieval Scandinavian society. Whether the blood eagle really happened is less important than what it meant to the people who told and retold these stories. This perspective shifts the focus from forensic investigation to cultural analysis. Instead of asking whether Ella of Northumbria actually died by the blood eagle, we might ask what the story of his death meant to the medieval Scandinavians who preserved it. What values did it express? What fears did it address? What aspects of their worldview did it illuminate? The blood eagle in this reading becomes a lens through which we can examine Viking Age concepts of honour, revenge, death, and the divine. It reveals a culture that saw violence as potentially sacred, that understood death as a transformation rather than simply an ending, that believed in the power of ritual to shape reality. Whether or not the ritual ever took place becomes secondary to its role as a cultural symbol, yet the question of historical reality refuses to disappear entirely. Each new archaeological discovery, each fresh analysis of the textual sources, each advance in forensic science holds the potential to shed new light on the mystery. DNA analysis of Viking Age remains, improved dating techniques, more sophisticated understanding of medieval linguistics. All of these might eventually provide the evidence that settles the debate once and for all. Until that day arrives, the blood eagle remains suspended between history and myth, between fact and fiction, between memory and imagination. It embodies something essential about our relationship with the past, our desire to understand not just what happened, but what it meant to the people who lived it. It reminds us that history is not simply a collection of facts, but a complex dialogue between past and present, between evidence and interpretation, between the stories we tell and the truths we seek. The storm clouds gather once more over the Norwegian fjords, and the wind carries with it the same whispers that have echoed across these landscapes for 1,000 years. Whether the blood eagle was carved in flesh or etched only in legend may ultimately matter less than the questions it forces us to confront about violence, meaning, and memory. In the dancing shadows of firelight, in the rustle of ancient parchments, in the careful measurements of forensic scientists, the mystery endures. The modern world looks back at the Vikings with a mixture of fascination and horror, seeing in them both the adventurous spirit that carried them to the shores of America and the brutal pragmatism that made them the terror of medieval Europe. The blood eagle has become a symbol of this duality, the thin line between civilization and savagery, between ritual and atrocity, between the sacred and the profane. Perhaps this is why the story refuses to die, why it continues to capture imaginations across centuries and cultures. In an age of sanitized violence and distant warfare, the blood eagle represents something immediate and visceral, something that forces us to confront the reality of human brutality and the complexity of human meaning-making. It asks uncomfortable questions about the relationship between violence and the sacred, about the ways in which cultures create meaning through ritual, about the power of fear and reputation in shaping historical events. As the camera pulls back from the ancient stones and weathered carvings, as the Norse drums fade to silence and the wind dies away across the fjords, we are left with more questions than answers. The blood eagle endures not because we have solved its mystery, but because we have learned to live with its ambiguity. In the end, perhaps that is the most Viking thing of all, to face the unknown with courage, to find meaning in mystery, and to understand that some stories are too powerful to be contained by simple truth or falsehood. The forensic approach to understanding the blood eagle has evolved significantly in recent decades, as new technologies allow us to examine ancient remains with unprecedented precision. Dr. Catherine Walsh, a bioarchaeologist specializing in trauma analysis, has spent years developing techniques to identify ritualized violence in skeletal remains. Working in her laboratory at Cambridge University, surrounded by microscopes and digital imaging equipment, she explains the challenges of detecting evidence that might have been overlooked by earlier generations of researchers. "The key is understanding exactly what we should be looking for, Doctor," Walsh explains, manipulating a 3D digital model of human ribs on her computer screen. If the blood eagle was performed as described, it would leave very specific cut marks on the posterior ribs, marks that would be different from typical sword wounds or other forms of trauma. The cuts would need to be precise, systematic, made with a sharp blade from a specific angle. Her team has developed new protocols for examining Viking Age remains, using high-resolution CT scanning and microscopic analysis to detect tool marks that might have been invisible to previous investigators. They've also created experimental models, working with forensic specialists and medical examiners to understand exactly what kind of evidence the ritual would leave behind. The results are both fascinating and frustrating. While they can now detect evidence of ritualized violence with much greater precision, they still haven't found the smoking gun that would prove the blood eagle's existence. The absence of physical evidence becomes even more intriguing when compared to other forms of ritualized violence from the same period. Archaeological sites across the Viking world have yielded clear evidence of human sacrifice, ritual killings, and elaborate burial practices that involved significant modification of human remains. The famous bog bodies of Denmark and northern Germany show evidence of multiple forms of ritualized killing, strangulation, throat cutting, blunt force trauma, sometimes all performed on the same individual. If the Vikings were capable of such elaborate ritual violence, why haven't we found evidence of the blood eagle? Dr. Lars Jørgensen, curator of the Viking Age collection at the National Museum of Denmark, offers one possible explanation as he walks through halls lined with ancient weapons and artifacts. We must remember that the bog bodies represent a very specific type of ritual sacrifice, one that was meant to preserve the victim for the gods. The blood eagle, as described, would have been about transformation and display. The body would have been left exposed, probably not buried at all. The very nature of the ritual would make archaeological preservation unlikely. This interpretation suggests that our lack of physical evidence might actually support the ritual's existence rather than contradict it. If the blood eagle was performed as a form of public display, as a warning to enemies or an offering to Odin's ravens and eagles, then the bodies would have been left to decompose naturally. The absence of preserved remains might simply reflect the ephemeral nature of the ritual itself. The linguistic evidence continues to evolve as scholars gain deeper understanding of Old Norse poetry and its conventions. Dr. Heather O'Donoghue, a specialist in skaldic verse at Oxford University, has spent decades analysing the complex metaphorical language of Viking Age poetry. Her work suggests that many descriptions that seem literal to modern readers were actually highly stylised poetic constructions that medieval audiences would have understood quite differently. The skaldic poets were masters of metaphor, Dr. O'Donoghue explains, surrounded by ancient manuscripts and modern linguistic analyses. They could describe a simple battle in language so complex and elusive that it would take modern scholars pages to unpack all the references. When we see phrases like carving the eagle, we need to ask ourselves whether this was meant to be understood literally, or as part of a complex poetic system that we're only beginning to fully comprehend. Her analysis of the specific Old Norse terms used in the Blood Eagle passages reveals layers of meaning that previous scholars may have missed. The word rista, usually translated as carve, could also mean write or inscribe, suggesting that the ritual might have been understood as a form of communication, a message written in flesh and blood. The word ørn, eagle, appears in numerous poetic contexts where it clearly doesn't refer to the literal bird, but rather to concepts of death, battle, and divine intervention. This linguistic complexity extends to the question of audience and interpretation. The sagas that preserve Blood Eagle narratives were not written for modern historians seeking factual accounts, but for medieval audiences who shared a complex cultural knowledge that we can only partially reconstruct. What seemed obviously metaphorical to a 13th century Icelander might appear literally descriptive to a 21st century scholar, and vice versa. The political dimensions of the Blood Eagle narratives also deserve closer examination. Many of the alleged victims were kings or other political leaders, and their deaths are often presented as moments of significant political transformation. The ritual serves not just as punishment or sacrifice, but as a form of regime change, a way of demonstrating that the old order has been completely overthrown and replaced. Professor Erik Valgren, a political historian at the University of Stockholm, analyses these narratives from the perspective of medieval power structures. When we look at the specific contexts in which Blood Eagle deaths are described, we often see moments of dynastic change, territorial conquest, or religious transformation. The ritual functions as a form of political theatre, a way of demonstrating that the new rulers possess absolute power over their enemies. This political reading suggests that the Blood Eagle narratives might have served propagandistic purposes, regardless of their historical accuracy. By claiming that their ancestors had inflicted such terrible deaths on their enemies, later Scandinavian rulers could establish their own legitimacy and discourage potential challengers. The stories functioned as both historical memory and political warning, preserving the reputation for ruthlessness that had made Viking expansion possible. The religious implications of these political uses are equally complex. If the Blood Eagle was indeed connected to Odin worship, then its performance would have been both a political act and a religious ritual. The victim would have been simultaneously enemy, sacrifice, and offering, a complex identity that reflects the interconnected nature of politics and religion in Viking Age society. Dr. Anders Andrén, a specialist in Scandinavian prehistory and religion, explores these connections from his research centre in Stockholm. We often try to separate politics and religion in our analysis of medieval societies, but this separation wouldn't have made sense to Vikings. A king was both political leader and religious figure. A battle was both military engagement and cosmic drama. The Blood Eagle, if it existed, would have operated on all these levels simultaneously. The question of gender also emerges from a closer reading of the sources. All the definitively identified alleged victims of the Blood Eagle were male, and specifically male rulers or warriors. This pattern suggests that the ritual, real or imagined, was deeply connected to concepts of masculine honour and warrior identity that were central to Viking Age culture. Dr. Judith Jesch, a specialist in Viking Age gender studies at the University of Nottingham, examines this aspect from her office overlooking the campus where she teaches Old Norse literature. The Blood Eagle narratives are very much about male honour, about what it means to be a warrior and a king. The ritual represents both the ultimate dishonour, being killed in such a brutal way, and paradoxically a kind of honour, since it acknowledges the victim as worthy of such elaborate attention. This gendered dimension adds another layer to the ritual's symbolic meaning. In a culture where masculine identity was closely tied to success in warfare, and the ability to die bravely in battle. The blood eagle represented a complex negotiation of honour and shame. The victim was dishonoured by the manner of death, but simultaneously honoured by the elaborate nature of the ritual and its connection to Odin, the god who collected fallen warriors for his hall. The comparative evidence from other cultures provides additional context for understanding the blood eagle's place in the spectrum of human ritual violence. Similar practices of ritualized execution and post-mortem display appear in numerous cultures throughout history, from the crucifixions of ancient Rome to the flaying rituals of Mesoamerican civilizations. Dr. Maria Santos, an anthropologist specializing in ritual violence, analyzes these parallels from her research institute in Mexico City. What we see across cultures is that extreme forms of execution often serve multiple purposes simultaneously, Dr. Santos explains, gesturing toward displays of ancient Aztec and Maya artifacts. They function as punishment, as sacrifice, as political theatre, and as cosmic ritual all at once. The specific form varies, but the underlying psychological and social functions remain remarkably consistent. Her comparative analysis suggests that the blood eagle, regardless of its historical reality, fits within well-established patterns of human ritual behaviour. The combination of extreme violence, religious symbolism, and political messaging that characterises the blood eagle narratives appears in numerous other cultural contexts, lending credibility to the idea that such practices could have existed in Viking Age Scandinavia. The preservation of blood eagle narratives through oral tradition before they were written down adds another dimension to their interpretation. Dr. Tommy Danielsson, a specialist in oral tradition at the University of Uppsala, examines how stories change and develop as they pass from speaker to speaker across generations. Oral tradition is not like a recording device. Dr. Danielsson explains from his study filled with collections of folk tales and narrative analysis. Stories evolve. They adapt to new audiences and new circumstances. Details that seem crucial to modern historians might have been fluid in oral performance, changing to suit the specific context of each telling. This fluidity suggests that the blood eagle narratives we possess in written form might represent just one version of stories that existed in many different forms during the centuries of oral transmission. The ritual might have been described differently by different storytellers, with some emphasizing its religious aspects, others its political dimensions, and still others its sheer brutality. The written versions that survive might reflect the particular interests and concerns of the scribes who recorded them, rather than providing definitive accounts of earlier traditions. The international dimension of blood eagle narratives also deserves attention. While the ritual is primarily associated with Scandinavian sources, references and parallels appear in other medieval European literatures. Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention similar practices, Irish annals describe comparable rituals, and even Byzantine sources include accounts of Viking brutality that echo blood eagle themes. Dr. Claire Downham, a specialist in Viking Age Britain and Ireland at the University of Liverpool, examines these cross-cultural references from her research centre, focused on medieval Celtic-Norse interactions. What's interesting is how similar narratives appear in sources that had no direct contact with Scandinavian saga tradition. This could suggest either that the practices were real and witnessed by multiple cultures, or that certain types of ritual violence represent universal human fears and fascinations that emerge independently in different cultural contexts. These international parallels complicate any simple interpretation of the blood eagle as either purely historical or purely mythical. If similar stories appear in multiple independent traditions, they might reflect real practices that were more widespread than previously thought. Alternatively, they might represent shared cultural patterns in how societies construct narratives about extreme violence and its meanings. The technological possibilities of the Viking Age also factor into assessments of the blood eagle's feasibility. Recent archaeological work has revealed the sophisticated metalworking capabilities of Viking smiths, their detailed knowledge of human anatomy from battlefield experience, and their access to surgical instruments through trade networks that extended from Greenland to Constantinople. Dr. Paul Mortimer, a specialist in Viking Age technology at the University of York, examines these capabilities from his laboratory, where replicas of ancient tools and weapons line the walls. The Vikings were far more technologically sophisticated than popular stereotypes suggest. They had access to extremely sharp, well-made blades. They understood human anatomy from extensive experience with wounds and death, and they had cultural practices that involved detailed modification of human remains. From a purely technological standpoint, the Blood Eagle would have been within their capabilities. This technological assessment doesn't prove that the ritual actually occurred, but it removes one potential objection to the accounts. If the Vikings had both the tools and the knowledge necessary to perform the Blood Eagle, then arguments about its feasibility become less relevant to discussions of its historical reality. The eagle, carved in stone or flesh, in memory or imagination, spreads its wings across the centuries, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 years of speculation, fear, and fascination. Whether myth or memory, legend or history, it remains what it has always been, a warning and a wonder, a testament to the human capacity for both creation and destruction, a reminder that the past speaks to us not in the clear voice of fact, but in the complex poetry of story, symbol, and song. As we stand once more among the windswept stones of ancient Scandinavia, as the last light fades over fjords that have witnessed 1,000 years of human drama, we are left not with answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the questions themselves. The Blood Eagle endures because it embodies something essential about the human condition, our capacity for both transcendent meaning-making and unspeakable violence, our ability to transform brutal reality into powerful symbol, our need to find significance in suffering and order in chaos. The mystery persists, carved not in flesh, but in the collective memory of cultures that have long outlived the age that created it. In libraries and laboratories, in archaeological sites and academic conferences, in movies and novels and video games, the Blood Eagle continues its strange flight through human consciousness, carrying with it all the unresolved tensions of our relationship with violence, meaning, and the irretrievable past. In the flickering candlelight of monastery scriptoriums, where monks bent over vellum pages recording the deeds of kings and the miracles of saints, countless stories went unwritten. The iron shackles rusted in castle dungeons, the wooden ploughs guided by calloused hands weathered to dust, and the voices of those who bore the heaviest burdens of medieval society faded into historical silence. These were the medieval slaves, men, women and children, whose labour built cathedrals, harvested grain that fed nobles, and whose very bodies were counted among the assets of their masters alongside livestock and land. The distinction between slavery and serfdom in medieval times was not merely academic, it was the difference between being property that could be bought, sold, and moved at will, versus being bound to specific land with certain protections under feudal law. While serfs were tied to the soil they worked, slaves were chattel, human possessions who could be transported across kingdoms, gifted to allies, or sold in bustling marketplaces from Novgorod to Cordoba. This forgotten class existed in the shadows of medieval civilization, their experiences rarely deemed worthy of chronicle by the literate elite who controlled the historical narrative. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century marked not the end of slavery, but its transformation. As the centralized Roman system of latifundia, vast slave-worked estates, crumbled under barbarian invasions and economic pressures, slavery evolved into new forms across the emerging medieval kingdoms. The Germanic tribes who carved up Roman territories brought their own traditions of bondage, while the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, later known as Byzantium, maintained and adapted classical slavery alongside new forms of servitude. The sources of medieval slaves were as varied as they were tragic. War captives formed the largest category, swept up in the endless conflicts that plagued early medieval Europe. When Viking longships returned from raids along the coasts of Ireland, England and Francia, their holds were often packed with human cargo destined for the slave markets of Hedeby or Kiev. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records how Danish raiders carried off thousands of captives, while Irish annals speak of entire villages emptied by Norse slavers who prowled the western seas. Criminal punishment provided another steady stream of slaves. Medieval legal codes often prescribed enslavement for serious crimes, transforming free men and women into property as punishment for theft, assault or debt default. The laws of Ethelbert, one of the earliest Anglo-Saxon legal codes, specifically outlined circumstances under which free persons could be reduced to slavery, while Frankish capitularies established similar provisions throughout Charlemagne's empire. Debt bondage created perhaps the most heartbreaking cases of enslavement. In times of famine or economic hardship, free peasants would sometimes sell themselves or their children into slavery to avoid starvation. Medieval documents reveal transactions where parents desperate to feed their remaining children would hand over a son or daughter to local nobles in exchange for grain or livestock. These sales were often presented as temporary arrangements, but in practice, few families possessed the means to buy back their relatives. Birth into slavery perpetuated the system across generations. The children of slave women typically inherited their mother's status, regardless of their father's condition. This principle, encoded in various medieval law codes, ensured a constant supply of bondspeople without the need for external sources. In some regions, entire communities of slaves developed, living in separate quarters but working the same lands for generations. The geographic distribution of medieval slavery varied dramatically across Europe and the Mediterranean world. In Western Europe, particularly in the former Roman territories of Gaul, Italy and Hispania, traditional chattel slavery gradually gave way to various forms of serfdom and bound labour as the feudal system consolidated. However, this transition was neither uniform nor complete. Archaeological evidence from early medieval cemeteries in Francia reveals burials with slave collars and restraints well into the 8th and 9th centuries. Anglo-Saxon England maintained robust slave populations through the Norman conquest of 1066. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, records approximately 10% of the English population as slaves, though regional variations were significant. In some areas of the southwest, slaves comprised nearly a quarter of the recorded population, while in northern regions they were relatively scarce. These slaves worked primarily in agriculture, tending the domain lands of their masters and performing the heavy labour that sustained the Anglo-Saxon economy. Viking societies built their expansion on slave labour, with thralls forming the bottom tier of Norse social hierarchy. The wealth that funded Viking expeditions often came from slave trading, as warriors captured people during raids and sold them in markets across northern and eastern Europe. The Swedish trading centre of Birka and the Norwegian port of Kaupang served as major distribution points for human cargo, while Viking merchants transported slaves along the river routes of Eastern Europe to Byzantine and Islamic markets. Eastern Europe experienced some of the most intensive slave trading of the medieval period. The very word slave derives from Slav, reflecting the massive scale of human trafficking that swept Slavic populations into bondage. Viking and later German merchants organised sophisticated networks that captured slaves from the regions around modern-day Poland, Ukraine and Russia, transporting them via river routes to Constantinople and beyond. The city of Kiev became a major hub in this trade, where slaves were collected, sorted and prepared for long journeys to distant markets. The Byzantine Empire maintained the most direct continuity with Roman slavery practices. Byzantine legal codes preserved and updated classical Roman law regarding slaves, defining them as property while simultaneously acknowledging their humanity in certain contexts. Slaves in Byzantium worked in households, workshops and state enterprises, with some achieving positions of considerable responsibility within the imperial administration. The empire's extensive trade networks facilitated slave acquisition from surrounding regions, while diplomatic gifts between rulers often included human beings as prestigious presents. Islamic caliphates developed sophisticated systems of slavery that integrated religious law with practical administration. Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, established detailed regulations governing slave ownership, treatment and manumission, based on Quranic principles and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. These laws created categories unknown in Christian Europe, such as mudaba, slaves promised freedom upon their master's death, and mukatab, slaves working to purchase their freedom through contractual arrangements. The legal definitions governing slavery varied significantly across medieval regions and periods. In Western European kingdoms, the distinction between slaves and serfs became increasingly important as feudalism developed. Slaves were considered res, or things, that could be bought, sold and bequeathed like any other property. They possessed no legal rights, could not own property, and had no standing in courts of law. Their marriages required their master's permission and could be dissolved at will, while their children automatically became their master's property. Serfs, by contrast, were bound to specific lands and owed labour services to their lords, but they possessed certain customary rights that limited their exploitation. They could not be sold separately from the land they worked, had recognised rights to their small holdings, and enjoyed protection under manorial customs that governed their daily lives. While the distinction might seem academic to modern observers, it represented a significant difference in lived experience for those subject to these systems. Viking thralls occupied the bottom rung of Norse society, below free peasants, bondi, and wealthy landowners, jarls. Thrall status was inherited and seemingly permanent, with few recorded instances of manumission in Viking sources. These slaves performed the most dangerous and degrading work, from mining and metalworking to agricultural drudgery, while female thralls often served as concubines and domestic servants. The poetic Edda's Rígstula provides insight into Norse attitudes toward thralls, describing them as dark, ugly, and naturally suited for servile labour. Islamic slavery encompassed multiple categories with different rights and expectations. Domestic slaves, khadim, served in households, often achieving close relationships with their masters' families. Some rose to positions of authority within large households, managing other servants and overseeing complex domestic operations. Military slaves, known as mamluks in Arabic, formed elite units that eventually seized political power in several Islamic states. Concubine slaves, jawari, occupied a special status, particularly if they bore children to their masters, as Islamic law granted them protection and eventual freedom upon their master's death. Byzantine slavery maintained Roman legal categories while adapting to Christian influences. The Ekloga, an 8th century legal compilation, defined slaves as human beings who were nonetheless property, capable of being bought, sold, and inherited. However, Byzantine law also recognized slaves' spiritual equality before God, leading to regulations protecting them from excessive abuse and encouraging their eventual manumission as an act of Christian charity. The daily experiences of medieval slaves varied enormously depending on their location, their master's circumstances, and the type of work they performed. Agricultural slaves, who formed the majority in most regions, faced lives of grinding physical labour from dawn until dusk. They planted and harvested crops, tended livestock, maintained tools and buildings, and performed countless other tasks essential to medieval agricultural life. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters reveals cramped, poorly built structures that offered minimal protection from weather and disease. In rural settings, slaves typically lived in simple huts constructed of wood, wattle, and daub, or stone, depending on local building materials. These structures were usually smaller and less substantial than free peasants' homes, often lacking the storage spaces and workshop areas that indicated economic independence. Excavations at medieval sites across Europe have revealed slave quarters with packed earth floors, central hearths for cooking and warmth, and few personal possessions beyond basic tools and cooking implements. The workday for agricultural slaves began before sunrise and continued until darkness made outdoor labour impossible. They would tend livestock, bringing cattle, sheep and pigs to pasture, while ensuring none strayed or fell prey to wolves and other predators. During planting and harvest seasons, they worked alongside other labourers in the fields, but their status meant they received smaller food rations and had no claim to any portion of the harvest beyond what their masters provided for subsistence. Urban slaves faced different but equally challenging conditions. Those working in craftsmen's workshops might learn valuable skills in metalworking, textile production, or construction, but they remained property despite their expertise. Some masters allowed skilled slaves to work independently, keeping a portion of their earnings while paying the remainder to their owners. This arrangement, similar to the Islamic mukatab system, sometimes enabled slaves to accumulate enough money to purchase their freedom, though such cases were relatively rare. Domestic slaves in noble and wealthy merchant households often enjoyed better living conditions but faced different forms of exploitation. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse, with little legal recourse against their masters. The children born from these relationships occupied ambiguous positions. They were legally slaves, but often received better treatment due to their blood relationship to the master's family. Some eventually gained freedom and integration into their father's household, while others remained enslaved despite their partial free ancestry. Household slaves performed countless tasks that made medieval domestic life possible. They prepared meals, maintained fires, cleaned rooms, and cared for their master's clothing and personal possessions. In wealthy households, specialized slaves might serve as personal attendants, managing their master's wardrobes, arranging their hair, and attending to their hygiene. Others worked as grooms, maintaining horses and equipment essential for their master's status and mobility. The treatment slaves received from their masters encompassed the full spectrum of human behaviour, from genuine care and affection to horrific cruelty and abuse. Some masters viewed their slaves as valuable investments requiring proper maintenance, providing adequate food, clothing and shelter to preserve their working capacity. Others saw slaves as easily replaceable resources to be exploited without regard for their well-being or longevity. Religious authorities and legal codes attempted to establish minimum standards for slave treatment, though enforcement was often sporadic and dependent on local circumstances. Christian teachings emphasized the spiritual equality of all souls, while simultaneously accepting slavery as part of the natural order established by God. This theological tension led to regulations protecting slaves from the most extreme abuse, while maintaining the fundamental relationship of ownership and submission. The experiences of female slaves were shaped by additional layers of vulnerability and exploitation beyond those faced by their male counterparts. Women slaves were valued not only for their labour, but also for their reproductive capacity and sexual availability to their masters. The children they bore often became the property of their masters, creating emotional bonds that could be severed at will through sale or gift. Some female slaves developed close relationships with their masters' wives, serving as personal attendants and confidants, while others remained isolated and powerless within household hierarchies. Medieval slave trading networks were sophisticated commercial systems that connected regions across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The profits from human trafficking funded military expeditions, urban development, and the luxury consumption of medieval elites. Viking traders established routes that carried Slavic captives from Eastern Europe through the river systems of Russia to Byzantine and Islamic markets, while Mediterranean networks distributed slaves captured in raids and wars across North Africa and the Middle East. Venice emerged as one of the most important slave trading centres in medieval Europe, its merchants developing extensive networks that connected northern European suppliers with Mediterranean and Islamic buyers. Venetian documents reveal the scale and sophistication of this trade, with ships regularly carrying human cargo alongside spices, silks, and other luxury goods. The wealth generated by slave trading helped finance Venice's expansion as a maritime power and its spectacular architectural achievements. Constantinople served as the primary destination for many slaves captured in Europe, its markets absorbing thousands of captives annually during the peak periods of medieval slave trading. The city's position at the intersection of European, Asian and African trade routes made it an ideal distribution centre for human cargo. Slaves sold in Constantinople might end up serving in households across the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, or even distant regions of Asia through the extensive trading networks that connected the medieval world. Córdoba, the capital of Islamic Spain, developed into another major slave trading hub, receiving captives from Christian kingdoms to the north and distributing them throughout the Islamic world. The city's prosperity during the 10th and 11th centuries was built partly on this human traffic, which provided labour for agriculture, domestic service, and specialised crafts. The integration of slaves into Islamic Spanish society created complex social hierarchies that influenced the region's cultural development for centuries. Religious institutions played contradictory roles in medieval slavery, simultaneously opposing and perpetuating the system, depending on circumstances and theological interpretations. Christian monasteries often owned slaves while preaching spiritual equality, creating theological tensions that influenced medieval thought for centuries. Some religious leaders condemned slavery as contrary to Christian principles, while others defended it as part of the natural order established by divine providence. The Catholic Church's position on slavery evolved gradually throughout the medieval period, influenced by practical considerations as much as theological principles. Early Christian communities included both slaves and free members, with church leaders like St. Paul advising slaves to obey their masters, while encouraging masters to treat slaves humanely. This acceptance of existing social structures continued into the medieval period, with the church often owning slaves itself while advocating for their better treatment. Monastic communities across Europe owned substantial numbers of slaves who worked the extensive lands granted to religious houses by pious donors. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés near Paris possessed hundreds of slaves who cultivated the monastery's fields and performed domestic tasks, while English monasteries relied heavily on slave labour for agricultural production. These religious slaves were often better treated than those owned by secular masters, receiving regular food, basic health care, and protection from the most extreme forms of abuse. Some Christian saints and religious leaders actively opposed slavery and worked for the liberation of captives. St. Patrick, himself a former slave, dedicated much of his ministry to ransoming Christian captives from pagan Irish kings. St. Bathilde, originally a slave who became Queen of the Franks, used her position to prohibit the sale of Christian slaves and funded the redemption of many captives. These examples influenced later Christian attitudes towards slavery, while demonstrating the complex relationships between religious belief and social practice. Islamic theology developed detailed jurisprudence regarding slavery that attempted to balance acceptance of the institution with humanitarian considerations. The Quran encouraged the manumission of slaves as an act of piety, while establishing rules for their treatment that were often more protective than those found in contemporary Christian societies. Islamic law required masters to provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter for their slaves, prohibited excessive punishment, and established mechanisms for slaves to purchase their freedom. The concept of religious merit through slave manumission became deeply embedded in Islamic culture, with wealthy Muslims often freeing slaves as preparation for pilgrimage or in their wills as acts of charity. This practice created a continuous cycle of liberation that distinguished Islamic slavery from other medieval systems, though it also perpetuated demand for new slaves to replace those who gained freedom. Despite the systematic oppression inherent in slavery, medieval sources reveal various paths through which enslaved individuals could achieve freedom. Manumission, the formal granting of freedom by masters, was the most common route to liberation, motivated by religious conviction, personal affection, practical considerations, or legal requirement. Masters might free slaves as rewards for faithful service, expressions of Christian charity, or fulfillment of Islamic religious obligations. Self-purchase represented another pathway to freedom, though it required slaves to accumulate money through independent work or the generosity of others. Some masters allowed skilled slaves to work for wages in their spare time, keeping a portion of their earnings while paying the remainder to their owners. Over time, industrious slaves might save enough to buy their freedom, though the required sums were often substantial and the process could take decades. The wills of medieval masters frequently included provisions for slave manumissions, reflecting beliefs about the spiritual benefits of liberation. Some testators freed all their slaves upon death, while others selected specific individuals for liberation based on long service or personal affection. These posthumous manumissions created complicated situations for heirs who might inherit valuable property in the form of slaves while being legally obligated to release them. Royal pardons and legal interventions occasionally freed slaves, particularly in cases involving criminal convictions or disputed ownership. Medieval kings sometimes granted freedom to slaves as acts of mercy or political calculation, while legal disputes between masters might result in slave liberation if ownership could not be clearly established. These cases were relatively rare but demonstrate that medieval legal systems recognized slaves' potential claims to freedom under certain circumstances. The status of freed slaves, known as freedmen or freedwomen, varied considerably across medieval societies, but generally remained inferior to that of freeborn individuals. Former slaves often retained obligations to their former masters, providing labour services or portions of their income in perpetuity. Their children might inherit these obligations, creating hereditary relationships that resembled slavery in many practical aspects, while technically constituting freedom. Some exceptional individuals managed to rise from slavery to positions of considerable authority and influence. The Byzantine Empire produced several powerful eunuchs who began as slaves but achieved high administrative positions through their abilities and court connections. Islamic societies offered similar opportunities for military slaves who demonstrated exceptional skills in warfare or administration, with some eventually establishing their own dynasties. The gradual decline of chattel slavery in Western Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries resulted from multiple interconnected factors rather than sudden policy changes or moral awakenings. Economic transformations associated with agricultural improvements and population growth made free and semi-free labour more attractive to landowners than slave ownership. The costs of maintaining slaves throughout their lives often exceeded the benefits of their unpaid labour, especially as agricultural techniques improved and free labourers became more readily available. Legal and social changes also contributed to slavery's decline in Western Europe. The consolidation of feudal systems created alternative forms of labour organisation that better suited the decentralised political structures of medieval kingdoms. Serfdom provided lords with reliable labour while avoiding the risks and expenses associated with slave ownership, as serfs were responsible for their own subsistence and family maintenance. Religious influences played important roles in slavery's gradual disappearance from Western Europe, though their effects were complex and sometimes contradictory. Christian teachings about spiritual equality created moral pressures against the most extreme forms of human bondage, while the Church's emphasis on charity and redemption encouraged slave manumission as an expression of pious devotion. However, these same religious institutions often owned slaves themselves and adapted theological arguments to justify their continued use of unfree labour. The transformation of slavery into serfdom was neither uniform nor complete across medieval Europe. Regional variations in law, custom and economic conditions created a patchwork of labour systems that defied simple categorisation. Some areas maintained chattel slavery well into the late medieval period, while others developed unique forms of semi-freedom that combined elements of both slavery and serfdom. Eastern Europe experienced different patterns of labour system development, with chattel slavery persisting much longer than in Western regions. The continued conflicts between Christian and Islamic powers provided steady supplies of war captives for slave markets, while the less developed feudal structures in Eastern European kingdoms offered fewer alternatives to slave labour. The expansion of European trading networks also increased demand for slaves in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markets, making slave trading profitable for Eastern European rulers and merchants. The Black Death of the 14th century created unprecedented labour shortages that fundamentally altered relationships between lords and peasants throughout Europe. The massive population losses from plague deaths gave surviving peasants increased bargaining power, enabling them to demand better conditions and greater freedom of movement. Many lords found themselves forced to offer higher wages and improved treatment to retain the workers necessary for agricultural production. This demographic catastrophe accelerated the decline of unfree labour systems across Europe, as lords competed for scarce workers regardless of their legal status. Former serfs and slaves who survived the plague often found opportunities to escape their previous conditions and establish themselves as free labourers in regions desperate for workers. The social upheavals following the Black Death contributed to peasant revolts and labour movements that further undermined traditional relationships of bondage and dependence. The historical silence surrounding medieval slavery reflects the limited literacy of enslaved populations and the bias of medieval chroniclers toward the concerns of political and religious elites. Most medieval texts were produced by clerics, nobles, or educated merchants who rarely had direct experience with slave conditions or much interest in recording their perspectives. The voices of enslaved individuals were filtered through the observations and prejudices of their social superiors, creating a distorted historical record that emphasised the viewpoints of masters rather than slaves. Archaeological evidence has begun to supplement the limited written sources about medieval slavery, revealing details about living conditions, work environments, and cultural practices that were rarely described in contemporary texts. Excavations at medieval sites have uncovered slave quarters, restraints, and burial practices that provide insights into the daily realities of enslaved life. These material remains often tell different stories than the official chronicles, revealing the harsh conditions and cultural resilience of enslaved communities. The recovery of medieval slave experiences has important implications for understanding the development of later slave systems, particularly the Atlantic slave trade that transported millions of Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. While the scale and racial basis of American slavery differed significantly from medieval European practices, there were important continuities in legal frameworks, economic justifications, and social attitudes that connected these systems across time. Modern historians have worked to reconstruct the experiences of medieval slaves through careful analysis of legal documents, economic records, and archaeological evidence. This scholarship has revealed the diversity of medieval slavery systems and the agency that enslaved individuals exercised within the constraints of their bondage. Rather than passive victims, slaves appear in these reconstructed histories as complex individuals who developed strategies for survival, resistance, and occasional liberation. The legacy of medieval slavery influenced European attitudes toward unfree labour and racial difference that would shape later historical developments. The association of slavery with particular ethnic groups, such as Slavs in medieval Europe, established precedents for the racialization of bondage that would become central to Atlantic world slavery. The legal and theological frameworks developed to justify medieval slavery provided intellectual foundations for later systems of racial oppression and economic exploitation. Understanding medieval slavery also illuminates the gradual development of concepts of individual rights and human dignity that would eventually challenge all forms of bondage. The tensions between Christian teachings about spiritual equality and the practical acceptance of slavery created philosophical problems that medieval thinkers struggled to resolve. These intellectual conflicts contributed to the eventual emergence of more comprehensive critiques of slavery and other forms of human exploitation. The forgotten class of medieval slaves reminds us that the grand narratives of medieval history, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the building of cathedrals, the adventures of knights and pilgrims, depended upon the unpaid labour of countless individuals whose names were never recorded in chronicles or remembered in songs. Their experiences of suffering and endurance, resistance and adaptation form an essential part of the human story that connects medieval Europe to broader patterns of exploitation and struggle that continue to shape our world today. In the shadows cast by castle walls and cathedral spires, in the fields that fed medieval cities and the workshops that produced their goods, the enslaved millions of medieval Europe lived lives of quiet dignity amid systematic oppression. Their stories, gradually emerging from archaeological discoveries and careful historical reconstruction, challenge us to remember that human bondage was not an abstract institution, but a lived reality that shaped the experiences of real individuals who loved, suffered, hoped, and died largely forgotten by the societies they served. The recovery of their experiences represents not just historical curiosity, but an act of justice that acknowledges their humanity and their contributions to the civilization that emerged from medieval Europe.
In an age where chivalry clashed with bloodshed and faith stood guard over steel, the medieval knight was more than just a warrior. They were a symbol of an age that sought to reconcile the brutality of combat with the aspirations of the human spirit. And across the windswept battlefields of Europe, from the stone fortresses of England to the sun-baked plains of the Holy Land, these armored figures on horseback would shape the course of history for nearly a millennium. The medieval knight emerged from the ashes of the Roman Empire, born of necessity in a world where central authority had collapsed and local strongmen ruled through force of arms. Yet they became something far more complex than mere soldiers. They were landowners, judges, protectors of the faith, and the living embodiment of a code that promised to transform violence into virtue. To understand the medieval knight, one must first grasp the intricate web of relationships that defined medieval society. The feudal system, which reached its zenith between the 10th and 13th centuries, was built upon a pyramid of personal bonds and mutual obligations. At its apex sat the king, who granted vast estates to his most trusted nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. These great lords in turn parceled out portions of their holdings to lesser nobles, creating a chain of vassalage that extended down through society. The knight occupied a crucial position within this hierarchy. Unlike the great barons who commanded armies and held entire provinces, or the humble serfs who worked the land, knights were the mobile backbone of medieval military power. They were vassals who had sworn sacred oaths of loyalty to their liege lords, promising to serve 40 days each year in armed service. In return, they received either land grants known as fiefs or monetary compensation that allowed them to maintain their expensive equipment and war horses. This system had its roots in the military innovations of the 8th and 9th centuries. The Carolingian dynasty, which ruled much of Western Europe under Charlemagne and his successors, had developed new tactics centered around heavily armored cavalry. The Franks, building upon earlier Germanic traditions, discovered that mounted warriors could dominate the battlefield if properly equipped and trained. The The stirrup, introduced from the East, allowed riders to fight effectively from horseback, without being unseated by the impact of their own blows. As Viking raids and Magyar invasions terrorized Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries, local leaders increasingly relied on these mounted warriors for protection. The traditional Germanic custom of military service by all free men proved inadequate against fast-moving raiders who could strike and vanish before foot soldiers could respond. Only knights with their superior mobility and individual combat skills could provide effective defense against such threats. The path to knighthood was long and arduous, typically beginning in earliest childhood. Most knights were born into the nobility, inheriting not only the financial means to afford the expensive equipment and training required, but also the social connections necessary to secure a place in a noble household. However, the ranks of knighthood were not entirely closed to those of humble birth. Exceptional individuals could rise through acts of valor, service to the church, or by demonstrating unusual martial prowess. The formal education of a future knight began around age 7, when boys were sent away from their family homes to serve as pages in the household of a lord or established knight. This practice, known as fosterage, served multiple purposes. It created bonds between noble families, provided young boys with training they might not receive at home, and exposed them to the wider world of aristocratic culture. As pages, these young boys learned the fundamental skills expected of a gentleman. They were taught proper manners and etiquette, the basics of reading and writing in Latin, and the Christian faith that would guide their future conduct. They learned to ride horses, first on gentle mounts, and gradually progressing to more spirited animals. They observed the knights of the household, studying their behavior, their treatment of subordinates, and their interactions with other nobles. The religious component of their education was particularly important. Pages attended daily mass, learned to recite prayers, and studied the lives of saints who had combined martial prowess with Christian virtue. They heard stories of Roland defending Charlemagne's rear guard against the Saracens, of Saint George slaying the dragon, and of other heroes who had used their strength in service of God and righteousness. Around age 14, successful pages advanced to become squires, entering into a more intensive phase of training. Each squire was typically assigned to a specific knight, becoming his personal servant and student. This relationship was deeply personal and often lasted for life, even after the squire achieved knighthood himself. The bond between knight and squire was considered sacred, comparable to that between father and son. The squire's duties were both practical and educational. He was responsible for maintaining his knight's equipment, a task that required considerable skill and attention to detail. Medieval armor and weapons were complex and expensive, often representing a family's entire wealth. The squire learned to clean and oil chainmail to prevent rust, to adjust the fit of armor plates, and to keep sword edges sharp and true. He cared for his knight's destrier, the specially trained war horse that was as valuable as the armor itself. More importantly, the squire received intensive military training. He practiced daily with sword and lance, first against wooden targets and eventually against other squires under careful supervision. He learned the intricacies of mounted combat, discovering how to control his horse with his legs while wielding weapons with his hands. He studied tactics and strategy, learning to read the battlefield and understand the flow of combat. The squire accompanied his knight on campaign, tournaments, and hunting expeditions. In battle, he might carry additional weapons, tend to his knight's horse, or even fight alongside him if the situation demanded. These experiences provided practical education that no amount of training in the practice yard could match. The squire learned to manage fear, to maintain discipline under pressure, and to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. The transition from squire to knight was marked by an elaborate ceremony that had evolved from simple military necessity into a profound religious and social ritual. The knighting ceremony, or dubbing, typically took place when the candidate reached his 21st year, though exceptional circumstances might accelerate or delay the process. The ceremony began with a period of spiritual preparation. The candidate underwent fasting and prayer, often spending an entire night in vigil before the altar of a church or chapel. This vigil was not merely symbolic, but served to focus the young man's mind on the sacred nature of the commitment he was about to make. He confessed his sins to a priest, received communion, and meditated on the responsibilities he would soon assume. The actual dubbing ceremony was a carefully choreographed event that emphasized both the martial and spiritual dimensions of knighthood. The candidate's sword was blessed by a priest, transforming it from a mere weapon into a sacred instrument of justice. The young man knelt before his lord or sponsor, who delivered the ceremonial blow, originally a hard slap, but later refined to a gentle tap with the flat of a sword blade, that formally elevated him to knightly status. The religious undertones of the ceremony reflected the church's attempt to channel the warrior ethos of the nobility toward Christian ends. By the 11th century, ecclesiastical authorities had recognized that they could not eliminate warfare from medieval society, but they could attempt to regulate and sanctify it. The concept of the Miles Christi, or Soldier of Christ, became central to knightly identity. The newly dubbed knight swore solemn oaths that would govern his conduct for the rest of his life. He promised to defend the church and protect the weak, to be generous to those in need, and to maintain his honor even unto death. These vows were not mere words, but sacred commitments that bound him before God and his peers. The daily life of a medieval knight was far more complex and varied than popular imagination often suggests. While warfare was indeed central to their identity and purpose, knights spent relatively little time in actual combat. Most of their lives were devoted to the mundane but essential tasks of military preparation, estate management, and social obligations. The knight's primary military duty was to maintain himself in a state of constant readiness for war. This required daily training and practice, not only to maintain physical fitness, but to keep complex combat skills sharp. A knight might spend hours each day practicing with various weapons, working on his horsemanship, or drilling with other members of his lord's household. The skills required for effective mounted combat were so specialized and demanding that they could only be maintained through constant repetition. Hunting played a crucial role in this training regimen. Medieval hunts were not merely recreational activities, but serious military exercises that honed the skills needed for warfare. Hunting wild boar required courage and quick reflexes, as the cornered animal could easily kill a horse or rider. Pursuing stags through dense forest developed the horsemanship and navigation skills, essential for reconnaissance and pursuit in wartime. Hawking taught patience and the ability to work with trained animals, skills that translated directly to the management of war horses. For knights who had been granted fiefs, estate management was a constant responsibility. These men were not only warriors, but also landowners who controlled the lives and livelihoods of dozens or even hundreds of peasant families. They collected rents and taxes, administered justice in local courts, and oversaw agricultural production. The revenues from their estates funded their military obligations, paying for equipment, horses, and the wages of men-at-arms who fought under their command. The knight's role as a local judge was particularly significant. In an age when central authority was weak and travel was dangerous, the lord of the manor served as the primary source of justice for the common people. Knights heard disputes over land boundaries, marriage contracts, and criminal accusations. They imposed fines, ordered compensation for injuries, and in extreme cases pronounced sentences of death. This judicial authority was both a privilege and a burden, requiring wisdom and impartiality that not all knights possessed. The code of chivalry that supposedly governed knightly conduct was a complex and often contradictory set of ideals that evolved over several centuries. At its core, chivalry attempted to reconcile the violent realities of medieval warfare with Christian teachings about mercy, humility, and service to others. The result was a moral framework that emphasized honor, loyalty, courage, and courtesy, while struggling to address the fundamental tension between the knight's role as a warrior and his obligations as a Christian. Honor was perhaps the most central concept in the chivalric code. A knight's honor was not merely his personal reputation, but a tangible asset that affected his ability to function in medieval society. An honorable knight could be trusted to keep his word, to fulfill his obligations to his lord, and to treat his social inferiors with appropriate dignity. Conversely, a knight who lost his honor through cowardice, treachery, or dishonorable conduct might find himself ostracized from noble society, unable to secure marriage alliances or military appointments. Loyalty to one's lord was considered the foundation of the feudal system. A knight who broke faith with his liege lord was guilty of the most serious form of treason, punishable by loss of lands, titles, and often life itself. This loyalty was expected to be absolute, even when it conflicted with other obligations or personal interests. The literature of the period is filled with stories of knights who chose death rather than betray their sworn oaths. Courage in battle was another essential virtue, but chivalric courage was more complex than simple fearlessness. The ideal knight was expected to be brave not only in facing enemy weapons, but in defending the innocent, even when such defense offered no personal advantage. Stories of knights who risked their lives to protect travelers from bandits, or who challenged more powerful opponents to defend the honor of the weak, became central to the chivalric tradition. The concept of courtesy encompassed a wide range of behaviors that distinguished the knight from common soldiers. Knights were expected to be generous in victory, showing mercy to defeated enemies and protecting non-combatants. They should be eloquent in speech, cultured in manner, and skilled in the social graces that mark them as members of the aristocracy. This courtesy extended particularly to women of noble birth, who were to be treated with special reverence and protection. The reality of knightly conduct often fell far short of these lofty ideals. Medieval chronicles and court records are filled with accounts of knights who betrayed their lords, brutalized peasants, and violated the very principles they had sworn to uphold. The gap between chivalric theory and practice was a source of constant tension and criticism throughout the medieval period. Many knights were driven more by personal ambition than by altruistic ideals. The pursuit of wealth, land, and political power frequently trumped considerations of honor or courtesy. Knights might switch sides in conflicts based on which lord offered better terms, or used their military skills to terrorize local populations for personal gain. The phenomenon of robber knights who preyed upon merchants and travelers was common enough to require repeated intervention by royal authorities. The Church's attempts to regulate knightly violence through concepts like the peace of God and truce of God movements demonstrate the ongoing struggle to reconcile martial culture with Christian values. These initiatives sought to limit warfare to certain times and places, protecting churches, peasants, and other non-combatants from the worst excesses of military violence. The mixed success of these efforts highlights the difficulty of imposing moral constraints on a warrior class whose primary function was the application of force. Medieval warfare was the ultimate test of knightly skill and courage, but it was also a brutal and chaotic affair that bore little resemblance to the romanticized encounters of later literature. The knight's effectiveness in battle depended not only on his individual prowess, but on his equipment, his mount, and his ability to coordinate with other members of his unit. The evolution of knightly armor reflects both technological advancement and changing military tactics. Early medieval knights wore hauberks of chainmail, flexible garments of interlocked metal rings that provided reasonable protection against slashing weapons, while allowing freedom of movement. By the 13th century, knights began supplementing their chainmail with plates of steel or iron covering vital areas like the chest, back, and limbs. The development of full-plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries represented the pinnacle of the armorer's art. A complete suit of plate armor, properly fitted and maintained, could turn aside most weapons of the period. However, such armor was enormously expensive and required considerable skill to manufacture. Only the wealthiest knights could afford the finest armor, and even they might spend years accumulating a complete set. The knight's primary weapons were the lance and sword, each designed for specific tactical situations. The lance was the weapon of the charge, allowing the knight to focus all his momentum and that of his horse into a single devastating blow. Proper use of the lance required exceptional skill, as the knight had to control his mount, aim his weapon, and brace for impact all simultaneously. The shock of a successful lance charge could break enemy formations and decide the outcome of a battle. The sword was the knight's most personal weapon, often bearing his name or heraldic symbols. Medieval swords were not the crude clubs of popular imagination, but sophisticated weapons that balanced cutting power with speed and maneuverability. The longsword, which became increasingly popular in the later medieval period, was designed for both mounted and foot combat, with a blade long enough to provide reach advantage while remaining light enough for extended use. Other weapons in the knight's arsenal included maces and warhammers, designed to crush armor rather than cut through it, and crossbows, which could penetrate even heavy armor at close range. The choice of weapons often depended on the specific tactical situation and the knight's personal preferences and training. Siege warfare presented unique challenges for medieval knights. Unlike the open field battles that showcased their mounted combat skills, sieges required patience, engineering knowledge, and the ability to coordinate with infantry and specialists. Knights might find themselves directing the construction of siege engines, leading assaults on fortress walls, or enduring months of boring blockade duty. The Crusades, which began in the late 11th century, provided unprecedented opportunities for knights to combine military service with religious devotion. The call to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control appealed to knights for multiple reasons. The promise of spiritual reward, including the remission of sins, the prospect of winning new lands and wealth in the East, and the chance to demonstrate their prowess against worthy opponents. The reality of crusading was far harsher than the idealistic rhetoric suggested. The journey to the Holy Land was long, expensive, and dangerous. Many knights mortgaged or sold their estates to finance their participation, gambling their family's future on the uncertain prospects of victory. The climate, diseases, and unfamiliar terrain of the Middle East proved as deadly as enemy weapons. Countless crusaders died of dysentery, malaria, and other ailments before ever seeing combat. The cultural encounters between Western knights and their Muslim opponents were complex and often contradictory. While crusading propaganda portrayed the conflict in terms of absolute good versus evil, many knights developed respect for their enemies' military skills and cultural achievements. The Muslim world's advanced knowledge of medicine, mathematics, and philosophy impressed some Western observers, leading to cultural exchange despite the religious animosity. The military orders that emerged during the Crusades represented a unique fusion of knightly and monastic ideals. Organizations like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller combined martial prowess with religious vows, creating warrior monks dedicated to the defense of Christian pilgrims and territories. These orders accumulated vast wealth and political influence, but their success also highlighted the tensions between spiritual and temporal power. Tournaments emerged as both training exercises and social events that allowed knights to demonstrate their skills in a more controlled environment than actual warfare. These elaborate competitions began as simple mock battles, but evolved into sophisticated displays of martial prowess, courtly culture, and social status. The tournament provided a venue for knights to earn fame and fortune without the risks and uncertainties of actual warfare. Successful tournament competitors could win valuable prizes, including horses, armor, and monetary rewards. More importantly, they could build reputations that led to more lucrative military appointments or advantageous marriage alliances. Jousting, the most famous tournament event, was a highly ritualized form of single combat that emphasized individual skill over group tactics. Two knights would charge at each other across a barrier, each attempting to strike his opponent with a lance while remaining mounted himself. The sport required exceptional horsemanship, precise timing, and considerable courage, as even blunted weapons could cause serious injury or death. The pageantry surrounding tournaments reflected the increasing sophistication of courtly culture. Knights adopted elaborate heraldic symbols that identified them on the battlefield and in social settings. They commissioned poets and minstrels to celebrate their achievements, creating a literature of chivalric romance that elevated their deeds to epic proportions. The concept of courtly love, which became central to chivalric culture, represented another attempt to refine and ennoble the warrior ethos. This literary and social convention suggested that knights should dedicate their martial achievements to the service of noble ladies, transforming warfare into a form of devotional service. The knight was expected to be inspired by his lady's beauty and virtue to greater heights of courage and honor. The reality of courtly love was often more complex and limited than its literary representation suggested. Many of these relationships were highly stylized and symbolic rather than passionate or consummated. The lady served as an idealized figure who inspired the knight's conduct, rather than as a real person with whom he might have a physical relationship. The convention allowed for the expression of refined emotion and aesthetic appreciation, while maintaining the social boundaries appropriate to aristocratic society. The literature of courtly love, exemplified by the songs of troubadours and the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, created a cultural framework that influenced knightly behavior for centuries. Knights were expected to be not only warriors, but also poets, musicians, and sophisticated conversationalists capable of moving gracefully through the complex social rituals of court life. The decline of knighthood was a gradual process that reflected broader changes in military technology, political organization, and social structure. The rise of professional infantry, the development of gunpowder weapons, and the emergence of centralized monarchies combined to reduce the military effectiveness and political independence of the traditional knight. The Swiss pikemen and English longbowmen of the 14th and 15th centuries demonstrated that well-trained and disciplined infantry could defeat even the finest heavy cavalry. The battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt showed that knights were vulnerable to new tactical formations and missile weapons. The old certainties of knightly supremacy on the battlefield were shattered by the arrows at Agincourt and the pikes at Nancy. The introduction of gunpowder weapons accelerated this transformation. Early firearms were unreliable and slow to reload, but they could penetrate the finest armor and required relatively little training to use effectively. A peasant with a musket could kill a knight whose training had taken decades and whose equipment represented generations of accumulated wealth. Political centralization under strong monarchies reduced the independence that had made knights powerful. Kings like Louis XI of France and Henry VII of England systematically undermined the feudal system that had given knights their political and economic foundation. Professional armies loyal to the crown replaced the feudal levies that had been the knight's primary military role. Many knights adapted to these changes by transforming themselves into courtiers, professional soldiers, or administrators. The skills that had made them effective warriors, leadership, discipline, and strategic thinking, proved valuable in these new roles. Some founded military academies or mercenary companies that provided professional training for the new style of warfare. The knightly class gradually merged with the broader nobility, losing its specifically military character while retaining its social privileges. The concepts of honor, courtesy, and service that had defined chivalry were adapted to new contexts, influencing the development of diplomatic protocol, military officer codes, and aristocratic behavior. The literary legacy of knighthood proved more enduring than its military reality. The Arthurian romances, the chansons de geste, and other medieval narratives created a mythologized version of knightly life that continued to influence European culture long after the actual age of chivalry had ended. Works like Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur and the anonymous Song of Roland preserved and transmitted chivalric ideals to later generations. The Renaissance and early modern period saw a revival of interest in chivalric literature, even as the military and social realities that had created knighthood disappeared. Cervantes' Don Quixote both celebrated and satirized the chivalric tradition, highlighting the gap between romantic ideals and contemporary reality. The continuing popularity of such works demonstrates the enduring appeal of the knightly ideal. Modern military traditions retain echoes of medieval chivalry in their emphasis on honor, duty, and the protection of the innocent. Military academies still teach the importance of personal integrity and selfless service, values that would be recognizable to a medieval knight. The Geneva Conventions and other international laws of war reflect the same attempt to impose moral constraints on military conduct that motivated the medieval church's peace movements. The knight's commitment to service beyond personal gain, the willingness to risk life for abstract principles, and the attempt to combine physical prowess with moral virtue continue to resonate in contemporary culture. From the superhero narratives of popular entertainment to the service ideals of modern military organizations, the influence of medieval chivalry persists in adapted forms. Though the clang of sword on steel has long faded, the image of the knight endures, not only in legend, but in the lingering shadow of a world that once believed valor could shape history. The medieval knight represents humanity's eternal struggle to transcend its baser instincts, to transform necessary violence into something noble and worthy. In their successes and failures, their nobility and brutality, their aspirations and limitations. The knights of medieval Europe created a legacy that continues to influence how we think about courage, honor, and the proper use of power. The stone castles still stand, weathered by centuries but enduring. The manuscripts still record their deeds, faded but legible. The ideals they championed, however imperfectly realized, continue to challenge each generation to consider what it means to be truly noble in a world that often rewards the ruthless over the righteous. In this sense, the age of chivalry never truly ended. It simply transformed, carrying forward the eternal human hope that strength might serve justice and that honor might yet triumph over mere expediency. The transformation of knighthood from a primarily military institution to a social and ceremonial one was gradual, but inexorable. By the 16th century, the practical necessity that had created the medieval knight had largely disappeared, replaced by new forms of military organization and political authority. Yet the cultural significance of knighthood proved remarkably resilient, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving core elements of its original identity. In England, the ancient ceremonies of knighthood were preserved and institutionalized by the Tudor monarchs, who recognized their value in creating loyalty and binding the nobility to the crown. The Order of the Garter, established by Edward III in the 14th century, became a model for similar orders throughout Europe. These chivalric orders transformed military brotherhoods into exclusive social clubs that combined ceremonial pageantry with political networking. The Spanish conquistadors who explored and conquered the Americas saw themselves as latter-day knights errant, seeking gold and glory in distant lands much as their medieval predecessors had sought the Holy Grail. Hernán Cortés deliberately modeled his campaigns on the chivalric romances he had read in his youth, viewing his conquest of the Aztec Empire as a knightly quest. The reality of colonial conquest was far more brutal and exploitative than any chivalric ideal. Yet the conquistadors' self-perception as Christian knights gave their actions a legitimacy that purely mercenary motives could not provide. The emergence of standing armies and professional officer corps created new contexts for chivalric values. Military academies established in the 17th and 18th centuries explicitly drew upon medieval traditions of honor and service, adapting them to the requirements of modern warfare. The Prussian military code, which influenced armies throughout Europe, emphasized duty, discipline, and sacrifice in terms that would have been familiar to a medieval knight. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries sparked a revival of interest in medieval culture that brought knighthood back into popular consciousness. Writers like Sir Walter Scott romanticized the Middle Ages in novels such as Ivanhoe, creating a nostalgic vision of chivalric society that bore little resemblance to historical reality, but captured the imagination of readers across Europe and America. This romanticized vision of knighthood influenced real political and social developments. The Gothic revival in architecture saw the construction of neo-medieval castles and churches that evoked the age of chivalry. Social reformers adopted chivalric language and imagery to advocate for causes ranging from the abolition of slavery to women's suffrage, arguing that true knights would protect the innocent and defend the helpless. The American Civil War saw both sides invoke chivalric ideals to justify their cause. Southern officers, particularly those from plantation backgrounds, cultivated an image of themselves as medieval knights defending their homeland against Northern aggression. Northern abolitionists, meanwhile, portrayed their cause as a chivalric quest to free the enslaved and restore justice to the land. The reality of industrial warfare, with its massive casualties and technological brutality, made such romantic comparisons increasingly difficult to sustain. The First World War marked a decisive break with traditional notions of chivalric warfare. The trenches of the Western Front, where machine guns and poison gas made individual heroism largely irrelevant, shattered romantic illusions about the nobility of combat. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon explicitly rejected the chivalric language that had been used to justify the war, describing instead the horror and futility of modern industrial warfare. Yet even in the aftermath of the Great War, chivalric ideals retained their power to inspire and motivate. The Royal Air Force deliberately cultivated a knightly image, portraying fighter pilots as modern knights jousting in the skies. The individual combat between pilots, the emphasis on honor and fair play, and the romantic danger of aviation all evoked comparisons to medieval chivalry. This romanticization of aerial warfare would reach its peak during the Battle of Britain, when RAF pilots were celebrated as the knights who saved civilization from barbarism. The Second World War presented more complex challenges to chivalric ideals. The scale of the conflict, the involvement of civilian populations, and the systematic nature of Nazi atrocities made traditional notions of honorable warfare seem inadequate. Yet resistance fighters, military leaders, and ordinary soldiers continued to draw upon chivalric language and concepts to explain their actions and motivations. The liberation of concentration camps was portrayed in explicitly chivalric terms, as knights rescuing innocents from the forces of darkness. The Cold War era saw chivalric ideals adapted to new forms of conflict. The CIA's gentleman's spy, exemplified by figures like William Wild Bill Donovan, combined traditional notions of honor and service with the practical requirements of intelligence work. The astronauts of the space program were portrayed as modern knights errant, exploring the final frontier in service of their nation and humanity. Popular culture throughout the 20th century repeatedly returned to chivalric themes, from the Hollywood westerns that portrayed cowboys as knights of the prairie, to the science fiction stories that transplanted medieval values to distant worlds. The enduring popularity of Arthurian legends in film, literature, and television demonstrates the continued relevance of chivalric ideals in contemporary society. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s challenged traditional chivalric concepts, particularly the notion that women needed male protection. Critics argued that chivalry was a form of benevolent sexism that limited women's autonomy while appearing to honor them. The debate over chivalry revealed deeper tensions about gender roles and the nature of honor in modern society. Military organizations have struggled to adapt chivalric concepts to contemporary warfare. The rules of engagement that govern modern military operations reflect many of the same principles that motivated medieval codes of chivalry. The protection of non-combatants, the humane treatment of prisoners, and the limitation of violence to legitimate military targets. International humanitarian law, codified in the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, represents a modern attempt to impose moral constraints on warfare that parallels the Church's efforts to regulate knightly conduct. The concept of the warrior diplomat, exemplified by figures like Colin Powell and James Mattis, combines military expertise with political sophistication in ways that echo the medieval knight's dual role as warrior and courtier. These modern military leaders are expected to be not only tactically proficient, but also culturally sophisticated, capable of operating effectively in complex political environments. Private military contractors and special operations forces occupy a unique position in contemporary warfare that bears some resemblance to medieval knighthood. These elite units operate with considerable autonomy, are bound by professional codes of conduct, and often develop strong esprit de corps based on shared values and experiences. Their emphasis on honor, loyalty, and professional excellence echoes many of the values that define medieval chivalry. The emergence of cyber warfare has created new contexts for discussions of honor and proper conduct in conflict. The anonymity of digital combat, the difficulty of distinguishing between combatants and civilians in cyberspace, and the potential for widespread collateral damage from cyber attacks have prompted calls for new codes of conduct that draw upon traditional concepts of proportionality and discrimination. Modern terrorism and asymmetric warfare have challenged traditional notions of chivalric combat. The deliberate targeting of civilians, the use of human shields, and the rejection of established rules of war by terrorist organizations have forced military professionals to reconsider how chivalric values apply in contemporary conflicts. The tension between effective counterterrorism and adherence to moral principles continues to shape military doctrine and public policy. The volunteer military forces that most Western nations now maintain represent a departure from the citizen-soldier model that replaced feudal levies. Yet they share certain characteristics with medieval knighthood. Professional soldiers choose their career path, undergo extensive training, and develop strong institutional loyalties that transcend individual interests. Military academies continue to emphasize honor, duty, and service in terms that would be familiar to medieval knights. The concept of humanitarian intervention, which justifies military action to protect civilian populations from genocide or other atrocities, represents a modern application of chivalric principles. The responsibility to protect doctrine, endorsed by the United Nations, explicitly draws upon the knightly obligation to defend the innocent and weak against oppression. Corporate culture has also adopted chivalric language and concepts, particularly in discussions of business ethics and leadership. The idea of the servant leader who puts the needs of subordinates and customers before personal gain echoes medieval ideals of noblesse oblige. Executive codes of conduct often emphasize integrity, loyalty, and service to the common good in terms that would not be out of place in a medieval treatise on chivalry. Sports, particularly contact sports like football and hockey, continue to valorize many of the physical and moral qualities associated with medieval knighthood. The emphasis on courage, teamwork, and fair play, combined with the ritualized nature of athletic competition, creates parallels to medieval tournaments. The concept of sportsmanship itself derives from chivalric ideals about proper conduct in competition. The superhero genre that dominates contemporary popular culture represents perhaps the most direct descendant of medieval chivalric literature. Characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman embody many of the same values that define the ideal knight: the protection of the innocent, the pursuit of justice, and the willingness to sacrifice personal interests for the greater good. The moral complexity of modern superhero narratives reflects the same tensions between idealism and pragmatism that characterize medieval discussions of chivalry. The digital age has created new forms of chivalric behavior and new challenges to traditional honor codes. Online gaming communities have developed elaborate rules of conduct that govern fair play and respectful interaction. While cyberbullying and trolling represent violations of digital chivalry, the anonymity of online interaction can either liberate people to act on their highest ideals or enable them to indulge their worst impulses without consequences. Environmental activism has adopted chivalric language to frame the protection of nature as a noble quest. Climate change activists portray themselves as knights defending the earth against corporate dragons, while conservationists see themselves as guardians of the natural world. This environmental chivalry combines traditional notions of protection and service with contemporary concerns about sustainability and stewardship. The The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned against represents a challenge to traditional chivalric values, as it can create incentives for conflict that serve economic rather than moral purposes. The privatization of warfare and the development of autonomous weapon systems raise questions about whether technological advancement is compatible with the human values that chivalry sought to preserve. In examining the legacy of medieval knighthood, we see not a simple progression from relevant to obsolete, but rather a continuous process of adaptation and transformation. The fundamental questions that chivalry attempted to address: how to reconcile necessary violence with moral virtue, how to balance individual honor with collective responsibility, how to use power in service of higher principles, remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The knight's quest for the perfect balance between strength and justice, between individual achievement and service to others, continues to inspire and challenge us. In a world where technology has made violence more powerful and more destructive than ever before, the chivalric insistence that might must be tempered by right remains urgently relevant. The medieval knights' greatest legacy may be not their military achievements or cultural innovations, but their persistent belief that human beings can transcend their limitations and achieve something approaching nobility. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, from climate change and global inequality to artificial intelligence and space exploration, we might find wisdom in the medieval attempt to create codes of conduct that elevate human behavior above mere expediency. The knight's armor may have become obsolete, but the values they represented, courage, honor, service, and the protection of the innocent, remain as vital today as they were in the age of chivalry. In this sense, we are all heirs to the knightly tradition, called to be champions of justice in our own time and place.
The wind carried more than salt and seaweed across the walls of Kaffa that autumn morning in 1346. It carried the scent of death, thick and cloying, mixed with the acrid smoke of burning pitch. Marco Grimaldi pressed his back against the stone ramparts, listening to the thunderous crash of another catapult stone striking the fortress walls. But it wasn't stone that made his stomach turn. It was what the Mongols had begun hurling over the walls 3 days ago. Bodies. Corpses bloated with disease, their skin mottled black and purple, flying through the air like grotesque birds before smashing into the courtyard below. The first few had been shocking enough, but now they came in waves. Men, women, even children, all bearing the telltale swellings in their necks and armpits that had decimated the Mongol camp outside the walls. "Madre di Dio," whispered Francesco, a young merchant from Marco's trading company. His face had gone ashen as another corpse sailed overhead, landing with a wet thud near the well. "They're using their own dead as weapons," Marco spat into the dust. He'd been trading along the Silk Road for 20 years, had seen plague sweep through cities before, but never like this, never weaponized. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very disease that was destroying the Mongol siege was now being gifted to the defenders of Kaffa. The Khan's forces were dying so quickly they could barely maintain their blockade, yet in their desperation they had found a way to share their misery. "We need to leave," Marco said, watching as several Genoese soldiers used long poles to push the latest corpse toward a growing pile near the eastern wall. "Tonight, while they're still dying out there faster than they can organise an assault." Francesco nodded eagerly. "The Santa Lucia is still seaworthy. Captain Benedetto says he can have her ready within hours." But as Marco gazed out at the Mongol camp, he could see the truth that Francesco couldn't, or wouldn't. The bodies being hurled over their walls weren't random casualties of war. They were selected, chosen for the particular darkness that had consumed them. The same darkness that he could already see creeping through Kaffa's streets in the glazed eyes of the dock workers and the fevered whispers of the guards. By nightfall, they were loading the last of their goods onto the Santa Lucia. The ship's hold was crammed with silk, spices, and precious metals, a fortune that would make them wealthy beyond measure if they could reach Genoa. But tucked between the cargo crates and coiled in the ship's ropes were passengers they hadn't invited. Black rats, their fur matted and eyes bright with hunger, and nestled in their coarse hair, tiny fleas gorged with infected blood. As the ship pulled away from Kaffa's harbour, under cover of darkness, Marco stood at the stern watching the city's torches grow smaller. He didn't know he was looking at the last lights of the old world. Behind him, in the hold, something small and dark scurried between the grain sacks, carrying within its blood a transformation that would reshape the very foundations of civilization. The journey from Kaffa to Constantinople took 12 days. By the 3rd day, the ship's cook was dead. By the 7th, they had lost 6 more crew members. Captain Benedetto, a weathered man who had sailed these waters for 30 years, had never seen anything like it. Men would wake seemingly healthy, complain of headache and chills by midday, and be dead before the next dawn. The swellings appeared overnight, hard, painful lumps in the neck, armpits, and groin that grew to the size of oranges. The fever that followed was merciless, driving men to delirium before the mysterious black spots appeared on their skin like some internal darkness bleeding through. "It's God's punishment," whispered Pietro the sailmender, crossing himself as they wrapped another body in canvas. "We've angered the Almighty with our greed, sailing from that cursed place." But Marco, educated in the universities of Bologna and Padua, suspected something more earthly at work. He had noticed the rats, how their population seemed to fluctuate in inverse proportion to the crew's health. When the rats died in great numbers, the sickness followed among the men. Yet none of the learned treatises he had studied, none of the medical wisdom of Galen or Avicenna, had prepared him for this. By the time they reached Constantinople, only 8 of the original crew of 23 remained alive. The harbour master took one look at their ship and ordered it quarantined, but not before several rats had already scurried down the mooring lines onto the docks. Marco watched from the ship's rail as the creatures disappeared into the maze of warehouses and market stalls that lined the Golden Horn. He felt like a man who had accidentally knocked over the first stone of an avalanche. 3 days later, the first dock worker in Constantinople began complaining of headaches. From Constantinople, the plague spread like spilled ink across parchment. Other Genoese vessels, some carrying survivors from Kaffa, others picking up the infection in contaminated ports, sailed westward toward home. The Santa Lucia itself, after losing half its remaining crew in Constantinople, limped towards Sicily with its deadly cargo intact. It was late October when the ship reached Messina. The harbour was busy with merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean, Venetian galleys heavy with Egyptian cotton, Catalan ships carrying Spanish wool, and Arab dhows loaded with African gold. It was the kind of thriving commercial hub that had made the Mediterranean the highway of medieval prosperity. Within weeks, it would become the gateway of apocalypse. Father Alessandro Toretti stood on the wharf as the Santa Lucia approached, his brown Franciscan robes whipping in the autumn wind. Something about the ship troubled him, the way it moved too slowly, as if fighting against more than just wind and current. As it drew closer, he could see why. Bodies lay on the deck, and the few men still moving seemed to do so with the painful deliberation of the gravely ill. "Holy Mother of God," he breathed, making the sign of the cross. "What ship is this?" "Genoese by her flags," answered Captain Torino, the harbour master. "But I've never seen one come in like this. Look at the crew, half dead by appearances." The ship's gangplank came down with a crash, and Marco Grimaldi, now gaunt and fever-eyed but still alive, stumbled onto the dock. Behind him came the surviving crewmen, 3 men who looked more like walking corpses than sailors, and in the ship's hold, unseen by the gathering crowd of port officials and curious merchants, dozens of rats began their exodus onto Sicilian soil. "We come from Kaffa," Marco gasped, his voice hoarse. "The plague. It follows us like a curse. We've lost nearly everyone." Father Alessandro stepped forward, his pastoral instincts overriding his fear. "My son, you need rest and healing. The Lord's mercy..." "The Lord's mercy?" Marco laughed bitterly. "I've seen enough of God's mercy to last eternity, priest. This isn't divine justice. It's something far worse. It's hungry." The harbour master faced a dilemma that would be repeated in ports across Europe over the coming months. The ship clearly carried disease, but it also carried goods worth a fortune. The merchants of Messina had contracts to fulfill, debts to pay, families to feed. Commerce was the lifeblood of their city. How could they turn away a single vessel, especially when the nature of the sickness was still unclear? "We'll unload the cargo," Captain Torino decided, "but the crew stays aboard until we're certain they pose no threat." It was already too late. By the time the decision was made, the rats had been ashore for hours, scattering through the city's granaries and markets, and the fleas they carried were already seeking new hosts among the dock workers who had handled the ship's ropes. Within a week, the first cases appeared in Messina. A stevedore named Giuseppe, who had helped unload the Santa Lucia, woke one morning with a splitting headache and chills that no amount of wine could warm. By evening, the telltale swellings had appeared in his neck. By the third day, he was dead. His wife, Maria, who had nursed him faithfully, followed him within the week. Their children lasted only days longer. The pattern repeated throughout the city. Families wiped out in succession, entire neighbourhoods falling silent as the plague consumed them house by house. The physicians of Messina, trained in the classical texts and confident in their bloodletting and herbal remedies, found themselves helpless against an enemy that seemed to mock their learning. Dr. Salvatore Medici, the city's most respected physician, stood in his study surrounded by his medical texts, sweating despite the cool November air. He had tried everything: bloodletting to balance the humours, aromatic herbs to purify the air, prayers and incantations learned from both Christian and Islamic sources. Nothing worked. If anything, his patients seemed to die faster under his care than those left to their fate. Perhaps, he whispered to his assistant, a young man named Paolo who had somehow remained healthy despite their constant exposure to the sick, perhaps our learning is insufficient. Perhaps God has sent something beyond the reach of earthly medicine. Paolo, barely 20 and educated enough to read Latin but young enough to question authority, shook his head. "Master, what if it's not divine at all? What if it's simply something we don't understand yet? Something natural?" The suggestion was borderline heretical, but Dr. Medici found himself considering it. In his 40 years of practice, he had never seen a disease that moved so quickly, killed so efficiently, and seemed so utterly indifferent to the social order. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, priest and sinner, all fell before it with equal ease. As winter settled over Sicily, nearly half of Messina's population was dead. The survivors faced a choice that would echo across Europe: flee and risk spreading the plague further, or remain and wait for death to find them. Most chose to flee. Ships left Messina harbour daily, carrying refugees to Naples, Rome, Genoa and Marseille. Each vessel was a floating bomb, carrying not just desperate people but the rats and fleas that had made the plague possible. By Christmas of 1347, the Black Death, though it wouldn't acquire that name for centuries, had established beachheads in a dozen major ports across the Mediterranean. In Avignon, where the Pope held court in magnificent exile from Rome, the winter of 1347 passed in relative peace. The papal palace buzzed with the usual intrigues and ceremonies, while the city below thrived on the wealth that followed the church's presence. Lady Catherine de Montmorency wrote regularly to her sister in Paris, her letters filled with gossip about court fashion and ecclesiastical politics. But by spring, her letters took on a different tone entirely. "Dearest Marie," she wrote in March of 1348, her usually elegant script hurried and irregular, "I hardly know how to convey what has befallen our fair city. It began in the poor quarters, as such things do, but it has not remained there. Yesterday Father Bernard collapsed during Mass, blood flowing from his mouth as he tried to consecrate the host. Today, 3 more priests are dead, and the cathedral refuses new bodies for burial. There is simply no more room." She set down her quill and walked to the window of her townhouse, gazing out at streets that had grown eerily quiet. Where once merchants hawked their wares and children played, now only the occasional cart passed by, usually loaded with corpses wrapped in whatever cloth could be found. The bells that once marked the hours with calls to prayer now tolled constantly for the dead, their bronze voices creating a symphony of mourning that never ceased. "The physicians," she continued, returning to her letter, "have taken to wearing the most grotesque costumes, leather robes and masks with great beaks stuffed with herbs and spices. They look like monsters from a fever dream, and perhaps that is what they have become. Dr. Beaumont, who attended Papa before his death, told me privately that he has never seen anything like this plague. It mocks every treatment, ignores every remedy. It is as if death himself walks among us, choosing victims by whim alone. What Lady Catherine couldn't see from her window was the full scope of the catastrophe unfolding across France. In Paris, the university medical faculty had declared the plague the result of a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius, an explanation that provided no comfort to the families watching their loved ones die in agony. The city's graveyards had overflowed by April, forcing authorities to dig enormous pits outside the walls where bodies were layered like cordwood. Pierre de Chauliac, a young medical student at the University of Paris, had abandoned his studies to work directly with plague victims. What he saw challenged everything he had been taught about medicine and the human body. The disease seemed to have two distinct forms, one that attacked the lymph nodes, causing the characteristic swellings, and another that went straight to the lungs, killing so quickly that victims sometimes died while still walking. "Master Guillaume," he said to his former professor, finding the old man in his study surrounded by ancient texts, "the Galenic system provides no explanation for what we're seeing. The four humours, the theory of contagion by miasma, none of it applies here." Master Guillaume looked up from his manuscript of Avicenna, his face haggard. At 60, he had spent his life believing that all knowledge worth having was contained in the classical texts. Now that certainty was crumbling. "Then what would you propose, student?" "That we abandon 15 centuries of medical wisdom." "Perhaps," Pierre said quietly, "wisdom begins with admitting ignorance." In the poor quarters of Paris, where the plague struck hardest, Jean-Baptiste the gravedigger had long since stopped counting the dead. At first, he'd tried to maintain the proper rituals, individual graves, prayers for each soul, careful record-keeping for grieving families. But by May, the corpses were arriving faster than he and his assistants could dig holes. "They die too fast to bless," he told his wife, Marie, as he stumbled home after another 18-hour day in the expanded cemetery outside the city walls. His clothes reeked of lime and decay, his hands were permanently stained black from handling corpses, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen the end of the world. "How many today?" Marie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "I stopped counting at 200. The pits we dug last week are already full. Father Michel says we may have to start using the old quarries outside the walls." He slumped into his chair, exhausting radiating from every line of his body. "The worst part isn't the numbers, Marie. It's how quickly people forget the dead. A week ago, these were merchants and craftsmen, mothers and children. Now they're just cargo." The plague's impact extended far beyond the raw numbers of the dead. In Strasbourg, the Jewish quarter burned while families like the Rosenbergs fled for their lives, accused by desperate Christians of poisoning wells and spreading plague through sorcery. Abraham Rosenberg gathered his family in their house as the mob assembled outside, knowing that centuries of coexistence were ending in a single night of terror. "Papa," his daughter Rebecca whispered, clutching her mother's hand, "why do they blame us? We're dying too." Abraham had no answer that would satisfy a 12-year-old. How could he explain that people in pain needed someone to blame, that fear made neighbours into enemies, that the same plague consuming Christian and Jew alike had somehow become a Jewish conspiracy in the minds of the terrified? The accusation was absurd. Jews were dying at the same rate as everyone else, but logic had no place in a world gone mad. The family escaped Strasbourg that night, joining the stream of Jewish refugees fleeing across Central Europe. Behind them, their synagogue burned, along with centuries of scholarship and community. The plague was killing more than bodies. It was murdering the very fabric of medieval society. By summer, the pattern was established across Europe. The plague moved along trade routes and rivers, striking cities first, then radiating outward to the countryside. It showed no respect for social hierarchy. Kings and peasants died with equal ease. In Florence, Boccaccio would later write that parents abandoned dying children, and children fled from dying parents, as natural affection dissolved in the face of absolute terror. The Church, which had provided stability and meaning for 1,000 years, found its authority crumbling. Priests died so quickly that there weren't enough survivors to perform last rites. Monasteries that had preserved learning since the fall of Rome fell silent as their brothers perished. Pope Clement VI, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of divine order, finally consecrated the Rhone River itself, allowing bodies to be thrown into its waters when the graveyards overflowed. The economic system that had sustained medieval Europe began to collapse. With a third of the population dead or dying, there weren't enough workers to bring in harvests, enough craftsmen to maintain trades, enough merchants to sustain commerce. Prices fluctuated wildly as supply and demand lost all predictability. Money became worthless when there was nothing left to buy and no one left to sell it. Yet even as the old world died, seeds of something new were being planted. In the devastated countryside of England, where entire villages stood empty and manor lords had no serfs to work their land, surviving peasants began to realise they possessed something previously unimaginable: bargaining power. Thomas of Wycliffe, a serf who had worked the same strip of land his entire life, stood in his lord's manor hall in the autumn of 1349, hat in hand but back straight. Sir William de Montfort, who had lost 2/3 of his peasants to the plague, sat behind his oak table trying to project an authority he no longer truly possessed. "I'll need twice the wages," Thomas said simply, "and Sundays free for my own work." "You forget yourself, serf," Sir William replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "You are bound to this land by law and custom." "Begging your pardon, my lord, but law and custom are dead in the fields along with everything else. You need workers, and there aren't enough of us left to work for the old terms." Thomas's voice was respectful but firm. "The manor across the valley is offering 3 times what you pay plus a cottage of my own." Sir William stared at the peasant, realising he was witnessing the death of feudalism. The plague had accomplished what centuries of peasant revolts had failed to achieve. It had made ordinary labourers indispensable. The ancient bonds of serfdom were dissolving not through revolution but through simple economics. There were too few workers left to maintain the old system of obligation and service. "Very well," Sir William said finally, "but I want your oath that you'll remain through the harvest." Thomas nodded, understanding that both men were improvising the rules of a new world. Behind him, outside the manor walls, fields stretched empty toward the horizon, dotted with the ruins of abandoned villages and the graves of a vanished way of life. In the monasteries that still functioned, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. Brother Francis of Assisi, named for the saint, though he possessed none of his namesake's cheerful faith, knelt before the altar of his monastery church, struggling with questions that threatened the foundation of his beliefs. Around him, the abbey that had housed 200 brothers now sheltered fewer than 30. The library, once the pride of their order, stood largely empty, as the monks who had copied and preserved manuscripts for generations lay buried in the cloister cemetery. "Why," he whispered to the crucifix above the altar, "why have you abandoned your faithful servants? Why do the innocent suffer while—" He couldn't finish the thought. While what? While the guilty lived. But he'd seen enough to know that the plague recognised no moral distinctions. Saints and sinners died with equal ease. Brother Francis had spent 20 years believing that God's will was ultimately just, that suffering served some divine purpose, that faith would be rewarded and wickedness punished. The plague had shattered those certainties. He had watched holy men die in agony while thieves and prostitutes survived. He had seen children, innocent of any sin, consumed by fever and pain. If this was God's plan, then God was either powerless or cruel, both possibilities too terrible to accept. The crisis of faith extended far beyond individual monks. Across Europe, the Church's carefully constructed theology was crumbling under the weight of inexplicable suffering. If the plague was punishment for sin, why did it kill indiscriminately? If it was a test of faith, why did the most devout suffer worst? If it was part of God's mysterious plan, what kind of deity would orchestrate such horror? Into this spiritual vacuum stepped the flagellants, bands of religious zealots who roamed from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in elaborate rituals of penance. They believed that by taking suffering upon themselves, they could atone for humanity's sins and end the plague. Their processions attracted thousands of followers, desperate for any action that might appease divine wrath. Brother Marcus, a former Benedictine who had joined the flagellants after watching his entire monastery die, led one such group through the towns of Bavaria. His back was cross-hatched with scars from months of ritual whipping, and his eyes held the fervour of a man who had found certainty in pain. "Repent," he cried to the crowds that gathered in village squares. "God's anger burns like fire, and only our blood can quench it. We have lived in sin and luxury while the poor suffered. Now the Lord calls us to account." The crowd watched in fascination and horror as Brother Marcus and his followers stripped to the waist and began their ritual. The crack of leather on flesh, the chanted prayers, the blood flowing freely. It was medieval theatre at its most intense, offering both spectacle and the hope of salvation through shared suffering. But even the flagellants couldn't ignore the evidence of their senses. Towns they had purified through penance continued to die. The plague showed no more mercy to the penitent than to the proud. Gradually the movement began to fragment as followers realised that self-torture was no more effective than any other remedy. In England, where the plague arrived in the summer of 1348, the social transformation was particularly dramatic. The island's feudal system, more rigid than most of continental Europe, shattered completely under the plague's impact. Villages that had existed since Saxon times simply vanished as their entire populations died. Ancient family lines that had held land for centuries ended with the generation. Margaret of Wessex, who had married into minor nobility and spent her life managing a manor household, found herself transformed into something unprecedented, a female landowner with real power. Her husband and both his brothers had died within a week of each other, leaving her as heir to estates that encompassed 3 villages and hundreds of acres of farmland. "The law says I cannot inherit," she told the royal magistrate who had come to settle the estate. "But the law also assumes there are male heirs to inherit. What happens when they're all dead?" The magistrate, a learned man who had spent his career interpreting precedent and statute, found himself in uncharted territory. The plague had created legal situations that no lawmaker had anticipated. Women inheriting land, serfs demanding wages, contracts becoming void because entire families had died. The very foundations of medieval law were proving inadequate to the new reality. "Perhaps," the magistrate said slowly, "we must interpret the law in light of current necessities. If you are willing to fulfill the feudal obligations, to provide knights for the king's service, to maintain order on your lands, then perhaps inheritance is possible." Margaret smiled grimly. "I have no knights left to provide, but I can offer something more valuable, crops that will actually be harvested, because I'm willing to pay workers what they're worth." The conversation illustrated a fundamental shift occurring across Europe. The plague hadn't just killed people, it had killed the assumptions that governed medieval life. Social mobility, previously limited to the most exceptional circumstances, suddenly became commonplace as traditional hierarchies collapsed, and survivors found themselves filling roles they had never been intended to occupy. By 1350, the plague's primary assault was ending, but its aftermath was only beginning. London, which had lost perhaps 40% of its population, had become a city of children and old people. The middle generation, those who had been in their prime when the plague struck, were largely gone. 10-year-old William Ashford wandered through streets he no longer recognised, scavenging for food among abandoned houses and trying to make sense of a world where all the adults had vanished. His parents had died in the summer of 1349, along with his 2 older brothers and his baby sister. For months he had survived by joining loose confederations of orphan children, moving from house to house, taking what they needed from the dead. It was a life that would have been unimaginable before the plague, children roaming freely through a great city, with no adult authority to constrain them. "There's bread in the baker's house on Milk Street," announced Sarah, a girl of perhaps 12 who had become the informal leader of their group, "and the door's still barred so no one else has been there." The children had developed their own ethics for survival. They took food from the dead but left valuables untouched. They avoided houses where bodies still lay unburied, understanding instinctively that decay brought danger. They shared everything equally and looked out for the youngest and weakest, creating a primitive but effective social order in the ruins of the old. William had learned to read by studying the books left behind in prosperous houses, though many of the concepts they contained, feudal obligation, religious doctrine, commercial law, belonged to a world that no longer existed. He was growing up to be something new, a child of the plague, raised without traditional authority, educated by necessity rather than design, forced to create meaning in a landscape of loss. The economic disruption caused by population collapse created opportunities as much as hardships. In the merchant quarters of Venice, Florence, and Genoa, surviving traders and craftsmen found themselves facing unprecedented demand for their services. The old guild system, which had carefully controlled production and maintained stable prices, simply couldn't function when half the guild members were dead. Antonio Vespucci, a wool merchant in Florence, sat in his office reviewing accounts that told the story of a world transformed. Before the plague, his family's business had been prosperous but predictable. Steady demand, stable prices, established relationships with suppliers and customers that stretched back generations. Now, the surviving textile workers could demand wages that would have been unthinkable just years before, while the reduced population meant that luxury goods were simultaneously scarce and less needed. "We're rich and poor at the same time," he told his son, one of the few young men to survive in their family. "Rich because we control resources that others need desperately. Poor because the world we knew how to navigate no longer exists." The plague had accelerated economic changes that might otherwise have taken centuries to develop. The careful balance between land, labour and capital that had sustained medieval prosperity was destroyed overnight. In its place, a new economy was emerging, one based more on individual initiative and less on traditional obligation, more on cash payment and less on feudal service, more on innovation and less on inherited privilege. Banking families like the Medici and Florence found themselves ideally positioned to profit from the chaos. With traditional economic relationships disrupted and new ones forming rapidly, there was enormous demand for financial services. The plague had killed many creditors and debtors alike, creating both opportunities for debt forgiveness and demand for new lending. It had concentrated wealth in the hands of survivors while creating new markets for goods and services. Yet the economic transformation came at a terrible human cost. In the countryside, where population loss was often even more severe than in cities, entire regions reverted to wilderness. Farmland that had been cultivated for centuries grew wild as villages emptied and manor houses fell silent. The careful agricultural systems that had sustained Europe's population growth during the High Middle Ages simply collapsed in many areas. Brother Thomas, one of the few surviving monks at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, spent his days walking through abandoned villages, trying to document what had been lost. His Latin chronicles, written by candlelight in a nearly empty monastery, preserved the memory of communities that had vanished completely. "The village of Petit Moulin, which in my youth housed 40 families, now stands empty," he wrote. "The church roof has fallen in, and wolves den in the nave where children once received communion. Of all the souls who lived there, none remain save old Marguerite, who refuses to leave her cottage though it stands alone in the wilderness." These chronicles, penned by surviving clergy across Europe, became some of the most important historical documents of the age. The monks wrote not just about death and destruction, but about the transformation they witnessed, how survivors adapted, how new communities formed, how the very concept of authority changed when traditional leaders were gone. Brother Thomas documented the rise of what he called new men, peasants who had become landowners, women who had taken over trades, children who had been forced to become adults overnight. He wrote about the breakdown of Latin as the universal language of learning, as local vernaculars became more important for practical communication. He recorded the decline of monasticism as a social institution, as young men chose marriage and trades over religious vows. Most importantly, he chronicled the birth of a new kind of skepticism. The plague had demonstrated that traditional authorities, religious, medical and political, were powerless against forces they didn't understand. This realization was creating a generation that questioned everything, that demanded practical results rather than theoretical explanations, that valued what worked over what was traditionally accepted. "The young men who survived," Brother Thomas wrote, "no longer accept that suffering is God's will, or that knowledge comes only from ancient books. They ask why about everything, and when we cannot answer, they seek their own explanations. I fear we are witnessing the end of faith itself, though perhaps what dies is not faith, but only faith in earthly authority." The cultural impact of the plague was perhaps as profound as its demographic and economic effects. In the visual arts, the cheerful religious themes of the High Middle Ages gave way to an obsession with mortality. Artists began painting danse macabre scenes showing death-leading representatives of every social class, pope and peasant, king and beggar, in an eternal dance. The message was clear: death was the great equalizer, and earthly distinctions meant nothing in the face of the grave. Master Giovanni, a painter in Siena, stood before his latest commission, a fresco for the cathedral showing the Last Judgment. But where earlier artists had emphasized salvation and divine mercy, his work focused on the physical reality of death and decay. Skeletons danced through his painted scenes, and even his angels seemed touched by melancholy. People want to see death represented honestly now, he explained to his apprentice, mixing pigments for another skull. Before the plague, we could pretend that death was distant, abstract, something that happened to others. Now everyone has seen bodies in the streets, has smelled decay, has watched loved ones die in agony. Art that ignores that reality seems like a pleasant lie. The apprentice, barely 16 but already a survivor of plague, nodded understanding. Master, will people ever want beauty again? Will they ever commission scenes of joy and celebration? Master Giovanni paused in his work, considering the question. Perhaps, but joy will mean something different now. It will be the joy of survivors, deeper and more precious because it exists in the shadow of loss, and celebration will be more intense because we know how quickly it can end. Literature too was transformed by the plague experience. Writers like Boccaccio in Italy and Langland in England began creating works that dealt directly with social upheaval and moral crisis. The old epic traditions, stories of noble knights and courtly love, seemed irrelevant to people who had watched civilization collapse and rebuild itself. New literary forms emerged. Dark comedies that mocked pretension, religious allegories that emphasized human frailty, secular stories that found meaning in earthly rather than heavenly concerns. By 1351, as the plague's initial assault finally ended, Europe faced the challenge of reconstruction. But this was not simply a matter of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Too much had changed for that to be possible. Instead, survivors had to create new institutions, new relationships, new ways of understanding their world. In England, King Edward III faced a crisis that no monarch had ever confronted. A kingdom where traditional authority had collapsed and needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. The feudal system that had provided military service and tax revenue was in ruins. Many of his nobles were dead, and those who survived often lacked the resources to fulfill their traditional obligations. The peasants who had once provided labour service were demanding cash wages and threatening to leave for better opportunities elsewhere. Your Majesty, advised William de Cherschel, one of the king's surviving justices, we must act quickly to restore order. If we allow these new customs to become established, the very foundation of royal authority will be undermined. The result was legislation like the Statute of Labourers, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from seeking better conditions elsewhere. But such laws were largely unenforceable. There simply weren't enough officials left to monitor compliance, and the economic reality was that landowners who needed workers had to pay market rates or see their fields go unharvested. Edward himself recognised that he was presiding over the end of one kind of monarchy and the birth of another. The old system of personal loyalty and feudal obligation was being replaced by something more bureaucratic and commercial. Kings would increasingly need to rule through paid officials rather than feudal vassals, would need to raise money through taxation rather than traditional service, would need to justify their authority through effectiveness rather than tradition alone. In the schools and universities that survived, educators faced the challenge of training a new generation for a world unlike any that had existed before. Master Robert de Stretton, who taught at Oxford, found himself revising curricula that had remained unchanged for centuries. We can no longer assume that students will enter a world of stable hierarchies and unchanging customs, he told his fellow masters. They need practical skills, accounting, law, medicine that actually works rather than medicine that sounds scholarly. They need to think critically about authority rather than simply accepting it. The plague had created an educational crisis, but also an educational opportunity. With so many positions left vacant by death, there was unprecedented demand for educated people who could read, write, calculate, and organise. Social mobility through education, previously limited to the most exceptional cases, suddenly became common as bright young people from humble backgrounds found themselves elevated to positions of responsibility. The Church too had to reinvent itself. The easy certainties of medieval theology had been shattered by the plague experience. Priests who survived often found themselves ministering to congregations that had lost faith in traditional explanations of divine justice. The official church response, that the plague was God's punishment for sin, rang hollow to people who had watched innocent children die, while corrupt officials survived. Father Michael of Hereford, one of the few parish priests to survive in his district, struggled to address his reduced congregation's crisis of faith. His church, which had once housed 200 families, now served fewer than 30. The elaborate ritual calendar that had structured medieval religious life seemed inadequate to people who had experienced such immediate and personal tragedy. God's ways are mysterious, he began his sermon, then stopped, seeing the sceptical faces before him. These were not the trusting parishioners of his youth, who had accepted religious authority without question. These were survivors who had seen too much to accept easy platitudes. "Father," interrupted Agnes the baker, one of the few women left in the village, "my 3 children died while the corrupt tax collector lived. Where was God's justice then?" Father Michael had no answer that would satisfy her, and he knew it. The traditional theology of divine punishment and reward had been proven inadequate by the plague's indiscriminate killing. He was being forced to develop a new kind of Christianity, one that acknowledged suffering without explaining it away, that offered comfort without false promises, that found meaning in survival rather than just salvation. "Perhaps," he said finally, "our task is not to understand God's will, but to serve each other in spite of our ignorance. Perhaps faith means continuing to love and hope when we cannot comprehend why such terrible things happen." It was a humbler theology than medieval Christianity had traditionally offered, but it was one that resonated with people who had been humbled by experience. The church that emerged from the plague would be less confident in its explanations, but more focused on practical charity, less concerned with abstract doctrine, but more engaged with immediate human needs. As the 1350s progressed, the shape of the new Europe began to emerge more clearly. In the countryside, the manor system was giving way to cash-rent relationships between landowners and farmers. Many serfs had simply walked away from their traditional obligations, knowing that labour shortages made them too valuable to pursue. Others had negotiated formal freedom in exchange for guaranteed service during critical seasons like harvest. Alice Carpenter, who had been bound to Lord Geoffrey's manor since birth, found herself signing a written contract that would have been unthinkable before the plague. She would pay 12 shillings per year for her cottage and garden plot, work 30 days during harvest season for agreed wages, and otherwise be free to pursue her own livelihood. It was the birth of a new kind of rural economy, based on mutual benefit rather than inherited obligation. "My grandmother would not recognise this world," she told her daughter as they walked home from the manor house. "In her time, a serf's word was nothing against a lord's command. Now Lord Geoffrey negotiates with us as if we were equals." Her daughter, born just after the plague, had no memory of the old system. To her, it seemed natural that workers should be paid for their labour, that families should be able to move if they found better opportunities elsewhere, that respect should be earned rather than commanded by birth. She was growing up to be a different kind of person than her ancestors, more independent, more questioning, more confident in her own worth. In the cities, the breakdown of guild restrictions had accelerated technological and commercial innovation. With traditional apprenticeship systems disrupted and demand for goods exceeding the capacity of established craftsmen, entrepreneurs began experimenting with new methods of production and organisation. Marco Bella Corte, a Venetian merchant who had survived the plague by fleeing to a country estate, returned to find Venice's commercial landscape completely transformed. Old trading partnerships had dissolved with the death of partners, new routes had opened as traditional suppliers disappeared, and there was unprecedented opportunity for innovation in both products and methods. Before the plague, he explained to his son, commerce was about maintaining relationships built over generations. Your grandfather traded with the same families in Constantinople that his grandfather had known. Success came from stability and trust built over time. He gestured toward the bustling harbour, where ships were loading and unloading goods from across the known world. Now, success comes from adaptation and speed. The old networks are gone. We must build new ones constantly, must be ready to change direction when opportunities arise, must compete on merit rather than inherited connections. The plague had inadvertently created conditions that would foster the development of capitalism. With traditional economic relationships disrupted, market forces operated more freely. Competition increased as guild restrictions weakened. Innovation accelerated as old methods proved inadequate to new circumstances. Capital became more mobile as inheritance patterns changed and new wealth accumulated in the hands of survivors. The intellectual transformation was equally profound. In the universities that continued to function, scholars began questioning fundamental assumptions that had gone unchallenged for centuries. The failure of traditional medicine during the plague had discredited not just specific remedies, but the entire theoretical framework of medieval learning. Master William of Ockham, teaching at the University of Paris, found himself developing new approaches to natural philosophy that emphasised observation over authority, experiment over tradition, practical results over theoretical elegance. His students, many of them plague survivors, were naturally sceptical of claims that couldn't be demonstrated. The ancients were wise, he told his students, but they were not infallible. Aristotle never saw the plague, Galen never treated plague victims. We must learn from their methods, careful observation, logical reasoning, but we cannot simply accept their conclusions. This approach would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution, though that development lay centuries in the future. More immediately, it began to change how people thought about authority and knowledge. The plague had demonstrated that traditional sources of wisdom, religious doctrine, classical texts, established custom, could be completely wrong about fundamental questions of life and death. The political implications of this intellectual shift were enormous. If traditional authorities could be wrong about medicine and natural philosophy, why should they be trusted about law and governance? If inherited wisdom could prove inadequate to new challenges, why should political power be inherited rather than earned? These questions wouldn't produce immediate revolution, but they planted seeds of doubt that would eventually flower into new concepts of legitimate authority. By the mid-1350s, the demographic impact of the plague was becoming clear. Europe's population had fallen by at least 1/3, and in some regions by half or more. This wasn't just a temporary crisis that could be solved by rebuilding. It was a fundamental transformation that would shape European development for centuries. The population decline had multiple cascading effects. Agricultural production fell not just because there were fewer workers, but because vast areas of marginal farmland were abandoned entirely. Many villages disappeared completely, their inhabitants either dead or relocated to more viable communities. The carefully balanced agricultural systems that had sustained medieval population growth simply collapsed in many regions. Yet the survivors often lived better than their ancestors had. With more land available per person and higher wages due to labour shortages, many peasant families achieved standards of living that would have been impossible before the plague. They ate meat more regularly, lived in larger houses, owned more possessions, and had greater personal freedom than previous generations had ever known. Brother Francis, still struggling with questions of faith in his depleted monastery, observed this paradox with troubled fascination. The world has become emptier, but also richer, he wrote in his journal. Those who remain have inherited the wealth of the dead, yet they seem haunted by their good fortune. They live better than kings once did, but they know that their prosperity is built on graves. The psychological impact of survival in such circumstances was profound and lasting. Plague survivors lived with a constant awareness of mortality that shaped every aspect of their experience. They celebrated more intensely because they knew how quickly joy could end. They loved more desperately because they had learned how easily the beloved could be lost. They planned more carefully because they understood how quickly circumstances could change. This survivor mentality began to influence European culture in ways that would persist for generations. Art became more realistic and emotionally intense. Literature focused more on individual psychology and less on abstract ideals. Music developed new forms that expressed complex emotional states. Philosophy shifted from grand systematic thinking toward more modest, practical concerns. The plague had also accelerated the decline of Latin as the universal language of educated Europeans. With so many clerics dead and fewer people receiving formal education, vernacular languages became more important for practical communication. This linguistic shift contributed to the development of national literatures and the gradual weakening of the international church's cultural dominance. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer was beginning to write poetry in English that rivaled anything previously composed in Latin or French. His Canterbury Tales, conceived partly as entertainment for plague survivors, celebrated the full range of human experience, sacred and secular, noble and common, tragic and comic. It was literature for a world where all social distinctions had been revealed as temporary, and where every individual story had gained new significance. The plague's impact on women deserves special attention, as it created unprecedented opportunities for female authority and independence. With so many men dead, women found themselves inheriting property, running businesses, and making decisions that had previously been reserved for males. These changes wouldn't immediately transform gender relations, but they established precedents that would prove important in later centuries. Margaret Kemp, a merchant's wife in King's Lynn, discovered after her husband's death that she had a talent for international trade. Before the plague, such activity would have been impossible for a woman of her background. But with traditional commercial networks disrupted and desperate need for entrepreneurial skill, she was able to build a trading business that stretched from England to the Baltic. "I never intended to become a merchant," she later wrote, "but necessity makes revolutionaries of us all. When the choice is between starving properly as a dependent widow or prospering improperly as an independent trader, the decision becomes clear." Her success was replicated by women across Europe who found themselves thrust into roles of responsibility by circumstance. Some managed estates, others continued their husbands' crafts, still others developed entirely new enterprises. While legal restrictions on female property ownership remained, practical necessity often overrode theoretical limitations. The plague had also transformed European relationships with the rest of the world. The demographic catastrophe had reduced Europe's ability to sustain the Crusades, contributing to the final loss of Christian territories in the Holy Land. But it had also reduced competition for trade routes and resources, potentially opening new opportunities for exploration and expansion. In the long term, the population decline would make Europeans more innovative and efficient, as smaller numbers of people had to accomplish what larger populations had previously done. This pressure for efficiency would eventually contribute to technological advances in agriculture, manufacturing and transportation that would give Europe advantages in global competition. By 1360, a full decade after the plague's initial assault, the outlines of the new Europe were becoming clear. It was a smaller, emptier continent, but also a more dynamic one. Traditional hierarchies had been shattered and rebuilt on more fluid foundations. Authority had to be earned rather than inherited. Innovation was valued over tradition. Individual initiative mattered more than collective conformity. The changes weren't uniformly positive. The breakdown of traditional community structures had left many people isolated and rootless. The questioning of authority had produced not just beneficial skepticism, but also cynicism that made cooperation more difficult. The emphasis on individual success had weakened bonds of mutual obligation that had provided security for the vulnerable. Yet for all its costs, the transformation had liberated human potential in unprecedented ways. The plague had accidentally created conditions that would eventually produce the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the emergence of modern democratic and capitalist institutions. It had forced Europeans to question everything, to innovate constantly, to adapt continuously to changing circumstances. Master Johannes, an elderly scholar who had survived both the plague and the intellectual upheaval that followed, reflected on the transformation as he prepared his final lectures. His university had been decimated. Of 40 masters who had taught there before the plague, only 7 remained. Yet the surviving institution was more vital and innovative than its predecessor had ever been. "We have lost much," he told his students, most of them young people who had grown up in the plague's aftermath. "Libraries burned, traditions broken, accumulated wisdom scattered to the winds. Yet perhaps something precious has been born from this destruction. You think for yourselves in ways that my generation never did. You question what we accepted without examination. You seek practical truth rather than comfortable theory." He paused, looking out at faces that bore the particular intensity of survival. "The world your children inherit will be stranger and more challenging than anything we can imagine. But you are better prepared for strangeness than any generation before you. You have learned that everything can change, that nothing is permanent, that adaptation is the price of survival. The plague had taught Europe's survivors to live with uncertainty, to find opportunity in crisis, to create new solutions when old ones failed. These lessons would serve them well in the centuries to come, as Europeans encountered new worlds, developed new technologies, and faced new challenges that would have overwhelmed more rigid societies. As the 1360s began, the transformation was largely complete. Medieval Europe, the world of fixed hierarchies, unchanging customs, and unquestioned authorities, was gone forever. In its place stood something unprecedented, a civilization that had learned to thrive on change, to find strength in diversity, to discover opportunity in destruction. The Black Death had killed 1/3 of Europe's population, but it had also killed the medieval world's limitations. From the ashes of that catastrophe, the modern world was beginning to emerge. The survivors who walked through the emptied landscapes of the 1360s were no longer medieval people. They were something new, carrying within themselves the seeds of transformations that would eventually reshape not just Europe but the entire world. The plague's legacy would prove more enduring than its mortality. Long after the last victim had been buried and the last empty village had been reclaimed by forest, the changes it had wrought in human consciousness would continue to drive European development. The survivors had learned that the impossible could happen, that the unthinkable could become routine, that the world could be remade in a single generation. They passed this knowledge to their children, who grew up expecting change rather than stability, innovation rather than tradition, opportunity rather than obligation. And so the Black Death, which had seemed like the end of the world, became instead the beginning of a new one, more uncertain perhaps, but also more full of possibility than any that had come before.